I never meant to sit next to him. That's the honest truth. And if I'm going to tell this story, really tell it, the way it deserves to be told, then I have to start there. With an accident. With a crowded library on a Tuesday morning in September and a backpack strap that slipped off my shoulder at exactly the wrong moment, sending my water bottle rolling across 3 rows of chairs and bumping to a stop against the leg of the one table I should never have walked toward. I wasn't thinking about Daryl Cobb. I wasn't thinking about anything, really. I was tired. I had a sociology reading due by noon and a granola bar in my pocket that was already crumbling. And I had maybe 4 hours of sleep behind me because my roommate Kyle had decided that 1 Amen was the ideal time to play acoustic guitar badly. I was just a guy with a rolling water bottle and a desperate need for a quiet seat, scanning the room for somewhere anywhere to sit. The library at Harlow University was almost always full by 8 in the morning. It sounds ridiculous. It sounds like the kind of detail you'd make up to explain a university that cares too much about its academic reputation. But Harlow genuinely had a culture around early studying, and by the time I stumbled in that morning, most of the good seats were gone. I saw one open chair at a cluster of tables near the window, wedged between a girl who had her laptop open and headphones on, and a very specific kind of silence I didn't recognize until I was already moving toward it. The kind of silence that has weight. I picked up my water bottle. I straightened up. I looked at the empty chair. And then I looked at who was sitting beside it. And my stomach did something I didn't have a word for yet. Daryl Cobb. Okay, I have to explain something before I go any further, because if you didn't go to Harlow, or even if you did, but you somehow managed to exist in a complete social vacuum, you might not understand what it meant to be looking at Daryl Cobb in a library at 8 in the morning and realizing the only empty seat in the entire room was right next to him. It meant you had two choices. You either took the seat and accepted whatever social consequences came with being the person brazen enough to sit beside the campus king, or you kept walking. You found a corner somewhere. You sat on the floor if you had to. You did not, under any circumstances, unless you were either extremely confident or extremely oblivious. Park yourself next to Daryl Cobb and act like it was a normal Tuesday. I was not extremely confident, but I was extremely tired, and I was, apparently, extremely oblivious that particular morning. So I sat down. I didn't make eye contact. I didn't say anything. I pulled out my notebook. I dug the granola bar out of my pocket. I opened my sociology textbook to the wrong page, and I stared at words that weren't registering at all because every single nerve in my body was suddenly very aware of the 6 inches of space between me and the most talked about person on this entire campus. I'd seen Daryl Cobb before. Everyone had. You couldn't be a student at Harlow and not know who he was, even if you'd never spoken to him, even if you'd only ever seen him from a distance. He was the kind of person who occupied space differently than everyone else. Not in an arrogant way, or at least not in the way arrogance usually looks, which is loud and deliberate and wants to be noticed. Daryl's way was quieter than that, more unsettling somehow. He was tall. That much was obvious even when he was sitting down, just in the way his shoulders settled and his back stayed straight without any apparent effort. He had dark hair that he kept neat, but not obsessively so, and the kind of face that looked like it had been designed to be photographed, which honestly, given how many times I'd seen it on university brochures and department posters and the athletics bulletin board outside the gym, maybe it had been. His skin was deep brown and clear, and even that Tuesday morning he was wearing a plain gray crew neck and dark jeans, and somehow managing to look like he'd been styled for a magazine shoot rather than a 8 a.m. study session. But it wasn't any of that that made him noticeable. It was the stillness. Everyone else in that library was moving, turning pages, shifting in chairs, typing, whispering to friends, reaching for coffee cups, the constant low-level restlessness of a room full of people trying to focus. And in the middle of all of it, Daryl Cobb was just still. He had a book open in front of him, a thick one, looked like something from the philosophy or political theory section. He wasn't underlining anything. He wasn't taking notes. He was just reading, and the way he was reading made it look like the rest of the library didn't exist. I told myself to stop noticing him. I looked at my sociology textbook. I found the right page. I started reading. I got through approximately 2 paragraphs before he spoke. That edition has a misprint on page 47. I looked up. He was still looking at his book. I looked down at my textbook. I looked up again. Sorry? Page 47. He turned a page in his own book, still not looking at me. The table in the second section. The column labels are transposed. If you're using it for citation, the data reads backward. I stared at him. Then I turned to page 47. There was a table. I looked at the column labels. I looked at the column labels. I looked at the data beneath them. And I'll be honest, I'm not the kind of person who immediately spots statistical transposition errors at 8 in the morning, but now that he'd said it, I could see that something looked off about the way the numbers lined up. Oh, I said. Huh. He still hadn't looked at me. Thanks, I said. He nodded slightly, not a full nod, more like an acknowledgement that sound had occurred in his vicinity. And that was it. That was the whole conversation. I spent the next 90 minutes in that seat, working through my reading, being very carefully normal, and internally reconstructing those 10 seconds of exchange approximately 40 times. By the time I packed up to leave for my 11 o'clock class, I had convinced myself it meant nothing. He'd noticed the textbook. He'd mentioned the error. That was the kind of thing a person with excellent academic instincts and zero social investment might do without it meaning anything at all about the person sitting next to them. I was probably one of 15 different people he'd said something to that week. I was probably nothing. I was definitely nothing. I didn't go back to that table the next morning. I'm telling you that up front, because I want you to understand that I wasn't chasing anything. I wasn't strategizing. I wasn't one of those people who saw an opportunity and moved toward it deliberately. When I walked into the library the next morning and saw that the table by the window was again the only one with open seats, and that Darrell Cobb was again sitting in the same chair with a different thick book and the same absolute stillness, I had a moment of genuine indecision. Then the girl behind me said, "Excuse me," because I was blocking the entrance, and I moved, and the only direction with a clear path was toward the window table. And, look. I sat down again. Different seat this time. One spot further away. If yesterday had been 6 inches, today was 18 inches. Marginally better. I told myself that was a meaningful distinction. He didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. I was fine with that. Preferred it, even. I opened my laptop. I started on a response paper for my modern lit class, and I was actually getting somewhere with it when I heard him turn a page and then go still in a different way. A more deliberate kind of still. The way someone gets still when they're about to say something. "You're in Hargrove's Modern Literature Seminar," he said. I looked up. He was reading his book. "Yeah," I said. "He assigns the response papers alphabetically. You'd be in the second group." I blinked. "How do you know that?" "I took his seminar 2 years ago. He assigns the second group early in the semester to establish a reading pace." A pause. The paper he wants isn't about the text. It's about the framework the text uses to address its central argument. If you write about the story, he'll grade you down. I looked at my laptop screen, at the 3 paragraphs I'd written about the story. "Oh," I said, "the framework is economic determinism. He has 3 published articles about it. Reading any one of them gives you the structure he wants in the response." I looked at him. He was still looking at his book. "That's really helpful," I said. "Thank you." He turned a page. I went back to my response paper, pulled up the university database, found one of Professor Hargrove's articles, and rewrote the whole thing from the beginning. It took an extra 40 minutes. When I finally got up to leave, I had 4 minutes to get across campus to my class. I paused at the table. "I'm Drew," I said, because it felt weird to leave without saying it. "Drew Mullen." He looked up. It was the first time he'd actually looked at me, and I know that sounds like a small thing. It sounds like the most ordinary social gesture in the world. But when Darrell Cobb looked at you, actually turned his eyes on you and held them there, it felt like being examined. Not unpleasantly. Not in a harsh way. Just thoroughly. "I know," he said. Then he looked back at his book. I walked to class in a mild daze. He knew my name. I turned that fact over the entire way across campus trying to find a normal explanation for it, and by the time I slid into my seat with 40 seconds to spare, I had settled on the most reasonable one. Harlow wasn't a huge school around 4,000 undergrads, and my name probably appeared on some shared roster or group project list or departmental email thread at some point. It wasn't remarkable that he knew my name. It was only remarkable because it was him. I got an A- on that response paper. Professor Hargrove wrote strong framework analysis in the margin. It was the best grade I'd gotten in that class all semester. I didn't tell anyone about either of my library conversations with Darrell Cobb. partly because there wasn't much to tell, partly because I didn't want to deal with the inevitable questions, and partly, and I'm going to be honest with you, even when it's embarrassing, partly because whatever those two brief exchanges had been, they felt like something I didn't want to hand over to other people to have opinions about yet. They felt like mine. The third morning, I went to the library and his chair was empty. I felt something drop in my chest, which was ridiculous, which I immediately told myself was ridiculous. I sat down in my usual seat. I opened my laptop. I started working. And I was so busy being aggressively normal about the whole thing that it took me a minute to register that I'd automatically sat in the chair beside the empty one. His chair, close enough that I was sitting in almost the same proximity as I would have been if he'd been there. I was so annoyed at myself. I moved 2 seats over. He showed up 20 minutes later. He sat in his chair. He opened his book. And after about 10 minutes of silence, without looking up, he said, "You moved seats." I looked up. Yeah. Why?" I opened my mouth and then closed it, because there was no version of the truth that wasn't embarrassing. "I like this spot," I said. A pause. "You sat closer for the first 2 days." I stared at the side of his face. He was still reading. "I thought you'd prefer the space," I said. Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, almost nothing. The faintest movement around the corners of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was the architecture of one. "I don't mind," he said. I sat there for a second. Then, very carefully, I moved back to the seat I'd been in for the first 2 mornings. 6 inches of space between us. He turned a page. We worked in silence for an hour. He didn't say anything else, and neither did I. And when I left, I felt, I don't know, steadier than I'd felt walking in, like something had been established, like a small, quiet understanding had been put in place between us. I told myself that was still not remarkable. That was just two people in a library finding a comfortable rhythm. I was so determined to believe that. The fourth morning, I came in and he was already there. He had 2 cups from the campus coffee cart on the table, one in front of his seat, one in front of mine. I stopped walking. He looked up briefly. "You take black," he said. Yes, how did you? You've had a black coffee the last 3 mornings. I sat down. I picked up the cup. It was warm. It was exactly right. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know." He went back to his book. I held the coffee cup and stared at the table and felt something I wasn't ready to name, sitting right in the center of my chest. Warm and careful and completely unasked for. "Thank you," I said. He made the slight sound that wasn't quite a word but meant acknowledgement, the one I was already starting to learn as a form of his language. I drank my coffee. I opened my laptop. We worked in silence, and that was how it started. Not dramatically, not with a grand gesture or a confession or any of the things that make a story feel like it's beginning. It started with a water bottle rolling across a library floor. It started with a misprint on page 47. It started with a cup of black coffee and 6 inches of space, and a guy who never talked to anyone apparently deciding, for reasons I still couldn't understand, that I was an exception. The questions came later. The feelings came later. The whole enormous weight of what this was came later. For those first few mornings, it was just quiet. And somehow that quiet felt like the most remarkable thing that had ever happened to me. By the end of the second week, people had noticed. That was the thing about Harlow's campus culture that I maybe hadn't fully appreciated until it became my problem. It was a small enough school that patterns were visible, social patterns especially. People tracked each other. Not maliciously, usually, but constantly. Who sat with whom, who walked to class with whom, who showed up at which table in the dining hall. It was the kind of ambient social awareness that was almost a reflex, and when something disrupted the expected pattern, it rippled. Daryl Cobb talking to someone every morning in the library was a disruption. I first became aware of it when my friend, Petra, who was in my sociology class, and had a gift for information gathering that was either impressive or mildly alarming, depending on your perspective, fell into step beside me on the way to Tuesday lecture and said without preamble, "Okay, so is it true you've been having morning study sessions with Daryl Cobb?" I looked at her. "What?" "No, we both use the same table in the library. People are saying you've been sitting with him every morning for 2 weeks." "People are saying that?" "Drew, She looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for when she thought I was being willfully obtuse. Daryl Cobb doesn't sit with people, like ever. He's been here 3 years, and as far as anyone can tell, his social interactions are limited to necessary exchanges in class settings and whatever happens at student council meetings. The idea that he's voluntarily sitting near the same person for 2 weeks and apparently talking to them is... He talks to me occasionally, I said. It's not like we're having deep conversations. He just mentions things sometimes. Academic things. Academic things. Notes about assignments. Textbook errors. That kind of thing. Petra looked at me for a long moment. Drew, do you understand what you just described? Him being helpful in a library, him initiating contact, repeatedly, with the same person. She shook her head. That is, by all accounts, completely unprecedented. I didn't say anything. So? She pressed. So what? So what's he like? Is he as cold as everyone says? Is the whole untouchable thing real? Or is it an act? Does he seem like he thinks he's better than everyone? Or is it more of an anxiety thing? Petra, I stopped walking. She stopped too. I'm not his biographer. We sit at the same table, and sometimes he says things. That's it. She studied me. You're being protective of him. I'm being accurate. There's something in how you said that. There isn't. Drew, we're going to be late for Kowalski's lecture, I said, and started walking again. She let it go, which was unusual for Petra, and which told me she'd seen something in my face that she was filing away for later. Petra was very good at filing things away for later. I spent the entire sociology lecture thinking about what she'd said. He initiates contact, repeatedly, with the same person. I'd been framing it as circumstance. Two people at the same table who happened to talk occasionally, but when I pulled back and looked at it the way she described it, him speaking first every single time for 2 weeks, with specific and personal information that he'd clearly been paying attention to accumulate, it looked different. It looked like something deliberate. I didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, I walked into the library and he was there. 2 coffees. His book. His stainless. He looked up when I sat down. He always looked up when I sat down now, and never at any other moment, and said the revised Hargrove paper is due Friday. The revised version should address the counter-argument in the 3rd section of the primary text. I didn't know there was a counter-argument, I said. There is. It's subtle. Hargrove considers it the most important part. He's mentioned it in 2 of his articles. How do you remember all this? I asked. You took his seminar 2 years ago. A pause. I remember things. Everything. He considered this. Most things. Most things. I looked at him. He was looking at his book. That sounds exhausting, I said. Something moved across his face again. That almost not a smile. Sometimes, he said. I picked up my coffee. Do you remember things you don't want to remember? A longer pause. He turned a page. Yes. I'm sorry. He looked up. That thorough, examining look. And then, why? Because that sounds like it would be hard. He held my gaze for a moment, longer than he usually did, and I noticed with the particular attention I was applying to everything about him these days that his eyes were dark brown and very steady, and that there was something in them when he looked at me that felt different from how most people looked at each other. More direct. Less performative. Like he was just looking. Actually looking. It is, sometimes, he said. Then he went back to his book, but the sentence had a different quality than his usual academic observations. Less informational, more like the edge of something personal, handed across the 6 inches of space between us, and then immediately covered over with the orderly silence we'd built. I thought about it for the rest of the day. I thought about a lot of things. About what Petra had said. About the way he'd framed himself. It is, sometimes, with a kind of blunt honesty that didn't apologize for its own weight, about the fact that he was remembering things about me. My coffee order. My seat preference. My class schedule. My professors. I wasn't nothing to him. Whatever I wasn't nothing. And that realization, quiet and careful and almost frightening in how much it mattered, was the first thing about Daryl Cobb that I let myself actually feel instead of carefully explaining away. Things progress the way things do between two people who are both trying to be careful, slowly, in increments. Each small exchange building on the one before it until the accumulated weight of them started to feel like something substantial. By the third week, we developed a rhythm that felt settled enough that I found myself adjusting my morning schedule to account for it. Not dramatically. I wasn't rearranging my life, but I started going to bed earlier so I'd be up in time to get to the library before the good seats were gone. And I started doing my reading the night before so I'd have something more interesting to work on at the table. And I started keeping a running list of questions I'd encountered in my coursework because I'd noticed that he engaged most readily when I asked something specific. That last one I noticed and immediately felt complicated about because it meant I was studying him, not in a creepy way, not consciously, not with any kind of agenda. But he was so guarded, so consistently reserved, that I started learning his patterns the way you learn the patterns of something rare and easily startled. The questions that made him elaborate, the topics that made him go quiet, the precise angle of stillness that meant he was thinking about something difficult versus the more relaxed stillness that meant he was simply present and comfortable. I was comfortable with him. That was the part I kept running up against. I was comfortable with Darrell Cobb, a person I had no earthly reason to be comfortable with, a person the rest of campus treated like a natural phenomenon, something to be observed from a safe distance. In his presence, without being able to fully explain why, I felt easy, like I didn't have to perform or explain myself or manage how I came across. Like I could just be whatever I was, and it would be received without judgment. One morning in the third week, he closed his book in the middle of a session, which he'd never done before, and said, without looking at me, "Can I ask you something?" I looked up. "Sure. Why do you come here every morning?" I considered the question. To study? You could study in your dormitory, or the department study rooms. A pause. You choose to come here specifically. I like the window table, I said. You didn't know about the window table before 2 weeks ago. I opened my mouth, then closed it. He was right. He had, with complete accuracy, identified the sequence of events. I hadn't had a window table habit before I stumbled into the one beside him. I like the quiet, I said, which was also true, just not the whole truth. He nodded. He seemed to accept that, or at least to be willing to leave it alone for now. He reopened his book. Why do you come here every morning? I asked. A pause. Same reason. The quiet? Yes. I thought about what it would mean for Darrell Cobb to need quiet. He was, as far as I understood, constantly surrounded by the particular kind of invisible noise that came with being the person everyone on campus wanted access to. Even when people weren't approaching him directly, he was the subject of conversations, the axis around which social structures organized themselves. The student council, the athletic department, the university administration, his academic department, all of them with stakes in him, expectations of him, a version of him that they needed him to be. A person needing quiet in that context meant something specific. The library is good for that, I said. It is. Another pause. Particularly this table. Because of the window? Because it's a corner. Peripheral. People who sit here are usually working, not socializing. A beat, and because the particular combination of ambient sound in this section of the building is conducive to focus. I smiled. You've thought about this a lot. I've been coming here for 3 years, and you never sat near anyone else. It wasn't a question. He heard it as one anyway. No, he said. I let that sit. I didn't push it. I was learning slowly that there were moments with Darrell where you had to let the sentence complete itself in the silence that followed, that trying to fill the space too quickly closed something that would have stayed open if you'd just waited. We worked in silence for the next hour. When I was packing up to leave, he said, still without looking at me, "You have a tendency to nod when you're processing something difficult." I stopped packing. Sorry, when you're reading something that doesn't align with your existing understanding, you nod twice. Slightly. It seems to be a habit you're not aware of. I stared at him. How long have you noticed that? First day. I sat back down for a second, not because I needed to, but because my legs had done something uncertain. You noticed that on the first day. I noticed things, he said. Simply, like it explained everything. What else have you noticed? I asked. He looked up. That examining look held a little longer than usual. You talk quietly to yourself when you write, he said. Not words, just sounds. thinking sounds. You bite your left thumbnail when you're frustrated with a text. You always position your notebook at a specific angle, roughly 15 degrees from horizontal. You smile when you read something that surprises you, before you've decided what you think about it. The smile happens before the thought does. Silence. I was looking at him. He was looking back at me. I stopped. Too much? He asked, and there was something new in his voice. Careful, slightly receded, like he was preparing to take it back. No, I said. It's not too much. I paused. It's just, nobody's ever told me what I look like from the outside before. Something in his expression softened, barely. Just a fraction. I shouldn't have. I liked it, I said. The softening deepened slightly. You pay attention, I said. Always. A pause. It's the thing I can't turn off. I thought about what he'd said before, about remembering things he didn't want to remember, about the exhaustion of it, and I understood in a way that felt new and careful and quietly significant. That his attention to the world, the hypervigilant comprehensive, constant noticing that had apparently cataloged my reading habits on day one, wasn't just a gift, it was also a burden. Does it bother you? I asked. Noticing everything? It depends on what I'm noticing, he said. He held my gaze for another moment. Then he looked back at his book. I finished packing up. I said goodbye, which I'd started doing that week, just a simple see you tomorrow, and he'd started nodding in response in a way that felt like confirmation. And I walked out of the library and stood on the path for a second in the September morning air, breathing it in. He'd noticed me on day one. He'd been watching me, quietly cataloging me the way he apparently cataloged everything. And he hadn't been bothered by what he found there. I let myself feel the warmth of that for exactly 30 seconds. Then I told myself to get it together and walk to class. I was fighting a losing battle, and I think part of me already knew it. The first time I met Petra's suspicion head-on was a Friday afternoon in the 4th week of semester, when she ambushed me at lunch with what I can only describe as a prepared presentation. Okay, she said, setting her tray down across from me and fixing me with the look that meant she'd been thinking about something carefully and was now ready to deliver findings. I've been watching the library situation. I kept eating. I figured, you two are there every morning. Multiple people have mentioned it. There's active speculation about what's happening. Nothing is happening. Drew. She leaned forward. Marcus from the athletic department says Daryl never talks to people in the library. Like, in 3 years, nobody has observed him having a sustained conversation with anyone who isn't a professor or an administrator. And you're in there every morning having, she made air quotes, academic conversations. We talk about coursework. You talk about more than coursework. I looked up. What do you know? Jamie Kwan is in 3 of your general ed classes. He sits near the window on the other side of the shelf sometimes. He says you two were talking for almost 20 minutes yesterday about, she checked her phone, urban soundscape design and whether architectural acoustics constitute an art form. I stared at her. He took notes, she said. Jamie took notes on your conversation because he was so stunned that Daryl Cobb was talking for 20 minutes straight about anything. I opened my mouth. Then I closed it, because she was right. We had talked about that yesterday. It had started because Daryl mentioned the acoustics of the library section we sat in, and I'd asked what he meant, and he'd explained the principles of how sound moved through enclosed architectural spaces, and then I'd said that it sounded like the building was doing something intentional with silence, and he'd gone very still for a moment, and then said that was an interesting way to frame it, and then we'd talked about it for, apparently, 20 minutes without my fully realizing. It was one of the best conversations I'd had all semester. So you're actually having conversations, Petra said. Yes, I said. We have conversations about acoustics and other things. What other things? I thought about the thread of the past few weeks, about the textbook corrections and the professor tips that had turned into comments about academic systems, and then into observations about learning patterns and memory and attention. About the morning he'd mentioned a paper he'd read about linguistic relativity, and I'd argued with him, which felt like something. About whether language shaped thought or just described it. About the time he'd shown me a passage in whatever philosophy text he was reading and said, "What do you think of this?" without preface or explanation. Like the question had been waiting to come out. Just things, I said. Things that come up. Petra studied me for a long moment. I was aware that my face was doing something she was reading. Drew, she said, more gently than before, are you falling for him? No, I said. Fast, too fast. She pressed her lips together, not smiling. Something more careful than a smile. Okay, she said. I'm not going to push that. Good. But Drew, she waited until I was looking at her. Whatever is happening, whatever it actually is, please be careful, because you're not the only one he's interacting with. He has obligations and a whole architecture of people and expectations around him that we don't really understand. And you, I know, I said. You have a very specific way of caring about people, she said. You do it quietly and completely, and then when it doesn't work out, you act like you're fine when you're not. And I just, Petra. I reached across the table and covered her hand. I know, I hear you. She looked at me for a moment, then she squeezed my hand and let it go, and picked up her fork and changed the subject to something about her political science seminar. And I let her, and I ate my lunch and laughed at the right moments and was a completely normal person. And then I thought about what she'd said for the rest of the afternoon. You're falling for him. I hadn't let myself use that framing. I've been very careful about the words I use internally, because words created shape and shape created reality. And if I named what was growing in the center of my chest every time I thought about Daryl Cobb, it would become something I'd have to deal with. But here's the thing about not naming something, it doesn't stop existing. It just exists without permission. And permission or not, what was happening to me in those morning library sessions was, look, I was finding myself looking forward to things. Specific things. The way he'd say my name sometimes. Drew. Just once. At the start of something he was about to say, like a point of orientation. The way he'd occasionally move his book or notebook to show me something. His attention suddenly direct and undivided. And the way that felt like being handed something valuable. The almost smile that appeared with increasing frequency in those moments when I said something that surprised him, and the fact that I'd started organizing my thoughts to try to produce it. I was trying to make Daryl Cobb smile. If that wasn't falling for someone, I didn't know it was. But he didn't, he was, the thing was complicated. The thing was that whatever this was between us existed in a very specific space, and I didn't know what the boundaries of that space were, or whether it was navigable in the direction I was afraid to look. I didn't know anything about Daryl Cobb beyond what I'd built up in 4 weeks of morning conversations. I didn't know about his life outside the library. I didn't know who his friends were, whether he had them. I didn't know about his family, his history, the things that had shaped the particular form his guardedness took. I knew that he remembered things he didn't want to remember. I knew that he needed quiet. I knew that he noticed everything. I knew that something had made him choose to sit beside nobody for 3 years, and then made him choose to speak to me. I wanted, more than I was comfortable admitting, to know the rest. The first time he talked to me outside the library was in the 5th week of October, on a Thursday evening when I was sitting in the campus quad trying to finish a paper and failing because the October air was too good and the geese on the central lawn were too entertaining, and I had genuinely been watching a specific goose conduct what appeared to be a territorial dispute with a second-year student for about 10 minutes. I was aware of someone sitting down on the far end of my bench before I looked up. Campus was busy in the late afternoon, lots of people moving through the quad, and bench sharing was normal. I didn't think anything of it until the person settled into a particular quality of stillness that I was starting to recognize, the way you recognize someone's footstep. I looked up. Daryl Cobb was sitting at the other end of my bench with his own notebook open, not looking at me. I stared at him for a second. Hi, I said. Hi, he said, writing something. Are you sitting here? Evidently. I looked around the quad. There were other benches, several empty ones. I looked back at him. Okay, I said. Is that a problem? No. I turned back to my laptop. We sat in almost silence for a few minutes, the quad noise around us creating a kind of buffer. It was different from the library. More ambient, less architectural, more of the organic movement of outdoor air and distant voices. But the core of it was the same, him and me and the particular quality of quiet that existed between us. The goose wins, he said. I looked up. He was looking at the lawn. The second-year student had, in fact, retreated from the bench near the central fountain. The goose occupied it triumphantly. I've been watching that for 15 minutes, I said. 8, he said. You've been watching for 8 minutes before I sat down. I saw you on my way across the quad. I looked at him. He was still watching the goose with an expression there was something in it I hadn't seen before. Something lighter, almost amused. You were watching me watch the goose? I said. It seemed worth observing. The goose or me? He turned his head slightly. The almost smile was fully operational. Both, he said. I felt warmth bloom up the back of my neck and took a decisive interest in my laptop screen. We worked in the quad until the lights started going, and the air turned cold enough that I pulled my jacket on. When I reached for my bag to pack up, he said, "How is the paper coming?" "Slowly," I said. "I got distracted by waterfowl territorial politics. You could have gone inside." The weather was nice. The weather was nice, he agreed, and there was something slightly different in how he said it. Something almost fond in it, like he understood the specific logic of prioritizing October air over academic productivity. "Do you ever just sit outside?" I asked. "Not working, just sitting." He considered this. "Not often." "Why not?" A pause. "When I'm outside without something to work on, I tend to be approached." He said it neutrally, factually, without complaint. But the fact in it was clear. Even an empty afternoon on the quad wasn't available to him the way it was to other people. Someone would see him and want something. "Oh," I said, "it's fine." "It doesn't sound fine." Another small pause. "It's the way it is," he said. I looked at him. He was closing his notebook, tucking it into his bag, back to his characteristic efficiency of motion. "Well," I said, "for what it's worth, if you want to sit outside sometimes and not be approached, and also have someone to observe diplomatic crises involving geese with you, I tend to be here Thursday afternoons." He looked at me. That long, thorough look. "I'll note that," he said. "Okay." He stood. He picked up his bag. He took 2 steps away from the bench and then stopped, his back to me, and said without turning, "Drew." "Yeah?" A pause. Just a beat. Maybe 2. "Thank you," he said. Then he walked away. I watched him cross the quad, people moving around him and away from him the way they always did. That particular orbit of untouchability he carried everywhere. And I thought, what is he thanking me for? I went over it on the walk back to my dorm. The conversation on the bench had been unremarkable, objectively. Geese. A paper. Weather. Nothing that warranted a thank you at the end of it, unless the thing being thanked wasn't the content of the conversation, but the fact of it. The simple fact of 2 people sitting in the October air, working in comfortable proximity, with nobody wanting anything from either of them. I thought about what that might mean to someone who couldn't be in public without it costing him something. I thought about it so hard, I walked past my dormitory building and had to turn back. The goose was still on that bench when I passed through the quad again. I nodded at it. Solid work, I thought. The thing about Harlow's campus in October was that it had its own rhythm, a seasonal swell that I'd experienced twice before in my first and second years, but that felt different this year because I was experiencing it alongside someone who noticed things differently than I did. The semester had built to a kind of momentum, midterms, student events, the campus buzzing with the particular productive anxiety of a school full of people who cared about their grades. And in the middle of it, quietly and without announcement, Daryl Cobb and I had become something. I didn't have a word for it. That was fine. Words could wait. The library mornings were now genuinely collaborative. We'd started exchanging observations about each other's work, not just him advising me on my coursework, but me occasionally catching inconsistencies in his arguments, which he received not with defensiveness, but with a kind of careful attentiveness that felt like he was genuinely considering the challenge. Once, I pushed back on a claim he was developing for a political theory paper, and he spent 10 minutes working through my argument against his, and then said, "You're right, the premise is insufficient," and rewrote the entire first section. He rewrote it because I'd pushed back. I sat with that for a long time after he left. The Thursday afternoon quad sitting had become a thing without either of us explicitly making it a thing. I started bringing 2 coffees on Thursdays. He started arriving with whatever book he was reading alongside his work, and sometimes he'd read instead of writing. And I'd learned that when he was reading rather than working, he was occasionally willing to talk about what he was reading, which opened up a completely different quality of conversation. He was reading an essay collection by a political philosopher who'd been writing about the ethics of obligation, specifically about the tension between what we owe ourselves and what we owe the people who have invested in us. Do you agree with her? I asked one Thursday. He considered. Partially. Which part? The premise that obligation to others is real and not merely constructed, that we do, legitimately, owe things to people who have shaped us. A pause. I'm less convinced by her resolution. She argues for a kind of negotiated middle ground. It feels theoretically tidy, but I think it underestimates the lived experience of the conflict. What does the lived experience of the conflict feel like? I asked. He was quiet for a moment, like trying to hold two incompatible truths in the same hand, he said, and knowing that whatever you choose, you'll have to grieve the one you let go. I looked at him. He was looking at the fountain in the center of the quad, where the geese were doing their daily circuits. That sounds personal, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. It is, he said. I waited. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. I'd learned not to push. But I filed it away with everything else I was quietly accumulating, about the person he was beneath the Campus King architecture, the obligation he felt, the incompatible truths, the grief that hadn't happened yet, but that he seemed to carry in advance. Something was pressing on him, something he hadn't put into words. Not to me. Maybe not to anyone. For what it's worth, I said, I don't think the middle ground is the only option. He looked at me. What's the alternative? Sometimes the conflict itself is the point, I said. Not resolving it, just living honestly inside it. Acknowledging both truths as real, even if they can't both be fully honored. That doesn't resolve the grief. No, I agreed, but it might mean the grief is honest, which maybe feels different than the grief you get from a compromise that was always slightly wrong. He held my gaze. His expression was doing something complex, something layered and careful, and beneath the layers, something that looked almost like relief, like a pressure was easing somewhere. That's a different argument than hers, he said. Is it wrong? A pause. No, he said. I don't think it is. We sat in the quiet. The geese circled the fountain, and something that felt like understanding, real, deep understanding, the kind that goes below the surface of words, settled between us in the October air. I didn't try to name it. I just let it be. I learned things about Daryl Cobb slowly, in the way you learn things about someone who is careful about themselves. Not through any grand disclosure, not through the kind of deliberate vulnerability you plan for. Through details, through the things that surfaced in conversation when he'd loosened enough to let something through. His father was a politician, not federal, local, a city councilor who'd built his career over 20 years on a platform of community investment and educational achievement. His name was Gerald Cobb, and he was, from everything Daryl described, without ever using the word pressure, a man who had enormous expectations of his eldest son. He introduced me as his investment once, Daryl said. October, week 6, library morning. I looked up. His investment? At a fundraiser dinner when I was 15. This is my son, my best investment. He meant it as a compliment. I watched him turn a page. How did it feel? I asked. Like being a variable in someone else's equation, he said, rather than a person. I thought about 15-year-old Daryl in a room full of adults, being referred to as an investment, and felt something that was mostly anger and partially grief on his behalf. Did you tell him that? No. Why not? A pause. He turned another page. Because he loves me. The investment framing comes from love. He wants things from me because he loves me, not despite it. That makes it complicated. It does, I agreed, but it doesn't make it okay. No, he said, it doesn't. Silence. He has a very specific idea of what my life should look like, Daryl said. Not like he was confessing, more like he was thinking aloud, testing the sentence in the air between us. What I should study, where I should work, who I should be associated with, and you're following that idea, I said. I'm studying what he wanted me to study. I've pursued the positions he thought would build the right profile. A pause. Student council. The academic honors. The athletics, though that was genuinely my choice initially. A very small pause. Most of it was genuinely my choice. That's the complicated part. I don't object to who I've become. I just wonder, sometimes, who I would have become without the architecture. I looked at him. He was looking at his book but not reading it. I think you would have been exactly who you are, I said. The architecture might look different, but the person doing the noticing and the remembering and the careful thinking, that's not something that was installed by someone else's expectations. He looked up. I held his gaze. The part of you that sat beside me and mentioned a textbook error instead of ignoring me, I said. That's not Gerald Cobb's son. That's just you. His expression was doing the complex layered thing again. Something moved through his eyes. Quickly, but I caught it. Something raw and close to the surface that he blinked past. You don't know that, he said. No, I said, but I've been watching you for 6 weeks, and I think I know a little bit. A pause. What have you watched? You give people more room than you take, I said. Even when you could take more, you notice things and use them to help rather than to navigate. I stopped myself before I said something that would reveal too much about how carefully I'd been watching. You're kind, in a very quiet way that doesn't want credit for it. He was very still. Nobody has ever said that to me, he said. That you're kind. That I'm kind, said like he was trying on the word. Most people would describe me as other things. Most people don't sit next to you every morning. The almost smile arrived, but softer than usual, softer and more exposed, like I'd accidentally caught him from an angle he hadn't prepared. No, he said quietly. They don't. We went back to work, but something had changed in the temperature of the morning, and we both knew it, and neither of us mentioned it, and the careful not mentioning of it felt more like acknowledgement than words would have. I wrote almost nothing for the next hour. I was too busy feeling something that had no name yet and didn't want one. November arrived with cold mornings and a campus full of people pulling out their winter coats and complaining about the semester's midpoint stress. I was managing fine, academically. Daryl's early semester guidance on professor preferences and coursework strategies had, in retrospect, built a framework that was paying off across multiple classes. I was doing better this semester than I had in my first 2 years, which my academic advisor had noted with visible satisfaction and attributed to developing focus. I had focus. I had very specific focus. It just wasn't purely academic in nature. There were other things happening, things outside the library and the Thursday quad sessions that I hadn't fully reckoned with. The campus gossip about us had escalated. I became aware of this incrementally. A comment from Kyle, my roommate, who'd heard something in the athletics building changing room. Apparently, some of Daryl's teammates were speculating. A past note in my sociology lecture that had clearly come from someone across the room wanting to know if the library thing was real. Petra updating me on what she was hearing through her network, which was extensive and reliable. The general consensus seemed to be one of two things. Either I was some kind of academic satellite that Daryl had found useful, a study partner, a practical arrangement, the campus king pragmatically deploying a convenient resource, or, in the more dramatic version favored by certain corners of the campus social ecosystem. Something else was happening, something that nobody wanted to say out loud because the implications were complicated. I tried not to think about the second version. The first version was easier. The first version I could hold without my heart doing anything unmanageable. The thing was, the first version required me to keep pretending that I didn't notice the way he'd started arriving at the library before me sometimes, and having my coffee ready before I sat down. It required me to ignore the way he remembered small things I mentioned. A book I'd said I wanted to read appearing on his side of the table a week later, open to a passage he'd marked with a small pencil check mark. It required me to discount the way he'd started lingering slightly when it was time to leave, taking an extra minute or two with packing up his bag, like the ending of each morning, was something he was slow to reach. The first version, just practical, just convenient, didn't account for any of that. And it didn't account for the morning in the first week of November when I came in and sat down and opened my laptop and he said, without preamble, I read the short story you published on the literary magazine. I froze. I had submitted a short story, a science fiction piece, experimental, kind of strange, to the university literary magazine in my second year. It had been published in their spring edition, which almost nobody read. I hadn't told anyone at Harlow about it, certainly not Daryl. You read it? I said. I found the archive online. I was looking through the literary magazine for something unrelated. A pause. I read it 3 times. 3 times. What did you think? I asked, and my voice was doing something careful that I was hoping he couldn't hear. I think it's the most honest thing I've encountered in a long time, he said. The premise, the character who can see the shapes of things but not the things themselves, is an unusually precise description of a particular kind of isolation. I was quiet. It surprised me, he said. That? You'd written it. Why? He considered. Because in person you seem completely present, not isolated. The character's experience felt like something remembered rather than something observed. A pause. Did you write it from personal experience? I took a breath. Somewhat, I said. I wrote it in second year. I was going through a period of not knowing how to be in rooms with people, of showing up and feeling like I was watching everything through glass. What changed? He asked. I glanced at him. He was looking at me, not at his book. Someone spoke to me, I said. The silence that followed was very full. I looked back at my laptop. He looked back at his book, but the air between us was different, charged with something that neither of us was going to say, that was understood without saying, that sat between us like a third presence at the table. It's a good story, he said finally. You should write more. Maybe, I said. You should, he said. Not maybe. A statement. I looked at him sideways. Is that a recommendation? It's an opinion, he said, but I am rarely wrong. I laughed. Actually laughed. A short, real laugh. Not a polite one. And he looked up at the sound of it, and the almost smile was fully a smile in that moment, brief and genuine and startling in the way a first snow is startling, expected in theory, but still somehow a surprise when it arrives. I held that smile in my memory for the entire rest of the day. I replayed it probably 6 times. By the end of October, we had started to exist in each other's lives outside the specific containers of library mornings and Thursday afternoons. It happened naturally, the way the inevitable usually does. Not in a rush, but in a series of small expansions. A text one evening when I was struggling with a reference for my philosophy paper, and he'd mentioned a relevant source. His name in my phone now, added with a casualness that belied how significant it felt. Me responding to a group project email and noticing his name in the thread. One of 3 student council representatives on a faculty committee, and having a strange, private warmth at the sight of it. We ran into each other at the campus coffee cart on a Wednesday morning and walked to the library together. It was maybe 4 minutes of walking. It felt like a milestone. He texted me once, just once, mid-afternoon on a random Tuesday. A photograph of a book cover with the message, "This is the one I mentioned about spatial cognition." The library has 2 copies. I went to the library that afternoon and got a copy. I read 30 pages before I ran into him, coming out of a student council meeting, and we stood in the corridor outside the meeting room for 15 minutes talking about it. A student council member passing by gave us the most overtly surprised look I had ever seen on another human face. Is it that strange? I asked after she passed. Daryl glanced in the direction she'd gone. For me to be standing in a hallway having a conversation? Yes, apparently. Does that bother you? Less than it used to, he said, and he looked at me when he said it, directly and briefly, before looking back at the hallway. Less than it used to. I didn't ask what had changed. I was getting better at knowing which things I could ask and which things needed to be left space. But I carried this sentence with me. The implication that something had shifted in how he was experiencing the exposure of being seen in conversation. That the prospect of people noticing felt less costly than it once had. Because of me? Maybe. I was terrified to assume. But the timing lined up. The problem was that there was something else building alongside the warmth. A kind of low-level ache. Because despite everything, the coffees and the conversations and the quarterly expansion of our orbit around each other, there was a wall. I could feel it. Not in the conversations themselves, which were increasingly genuine and deep, not in the attention he paid me, which was comprehensive and consistent. But somewhere at the edge of what he'd give. Somewhere at the limit of what he'd say. He never talked about wanting things for himself. He could talk about obligation, about other people's expectations, about his father and the architecture of his life, about philosophy and literature and the texture of ideas. But when the conversation edged toward what he wanted, what he'd choose, without context, without constraints, who he was in the private space of his own desires, He'd stop. Go still. Redirect. It was subtle enough that I wasn't sure I was reading it right, but I was very good at noticing Daryl by now, and I was noticing a wall. I didn't know what was on the other side of it. I was starting, quietly and with great caution, to wonder if I was on the other side of it. The first real test of whatever we were came in the second week of November, and it came from outside. His name was Marcus Chen. He was in Daryl's athletics program, a sprinter, genuinely kind and socially skilled in the way that made him comfortable everywhere. He'd been trying to integrate himself into Darlow's social life all semester, and he'd apparently decided that the key to this was getting access to Daryl Cobb. And the key to that, word had apparently gotten around, was me. He sat down at my table in the dining hall one afternoon with the practiced ease of someone who decided the outcome of the encounter in advance, continuing seamlessly from where Drew's story left off. Same voice, same rhythm, no breaks. "You're Drew Mullen," he said. "I am," I said. "Marcus Chen." He extended his hand like we were at a networking event, which I found both amusing and slightly exhausting. "I've seen you around. You're the one Daryl talks to, right?" I looked at him. "We know each other, yeah." "That's wild," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with the comfort of someone who'd never been told he took up too much space, because I'd been in the same athletics program as Daryl Cobb for 2 years, and I'd had maybe 40 words from the man total. And I've watched you two have what appears to be an extended philosophical debate in the quad on multiple occasions. "We talk," I said. "I don't know what you want me to tell you." "I want to know how," he said. I'm not trying to use you as leverage or anything. I'm genuinely curious." He paused. "Actually, I'm also slightly trying to use you as leverage, I won't lie. There's a student council and athletics joint project coming up, and I'd like to not have the most untouchable person in the room be completely inaccessible to me." I appreciated the honesty more than the strategy. "I can't broker that for you," I said. "I know." He shrugged. "But maybe if you were there when I talked to him, it would be less, fraught." "Why would my presence help? Because he's a different person around you." Marcus said it simply, like it was obvious. "I've seen it, from a distance, obviously because nobody gets close enough to actually observe it directly. But he's looser, less like a locked room." He paused. "He smiles around you." "Something happened in my chest. He's relaxed around you," Marcus continued. "And man, Daryl not being in full professional mode is apparently something this campus has never witnessed before, and I'd just like to experience it at least once before graduation." I looked at my food. "I'm not sure that's mine to give," I said. Marcus nodded slowly. He seemed to genuinely hear that. "Fair," he said. "For the record, I'm not asking you to manipulate anything. I'm just hoping that maybe, if I'm around and you're around and things are natural, something normal might happen." "I'll think about it," I said. He smiled. "That's all I'm asking." After he left, I sat with the conversation for a long time. Not the part about the joint project. I didn't care much about that. The part about Daryl being different around me. The part about the locked room. He smiles around you. I'd seen it. I knew it was true. But hearing it from someone outside, someone who'd known Daryl for 2 years and was genuinely struck by it, made it real in a different way, made it something that existed in the world and not just in my private observing. He was different around me. That was either the most wonderful thing or the most terrifying thing, depending on which direction I let myself look. I chose to sit with the wonderful for a while and not look at the terrifying. That choice lasted exactly 3 days. The terrifying arrived on a Thursday evening in the form of a name. Vanessa Park. Vanessa Park was a fourth-year pre-law student, and she was, by the consensus of basically everyone at Harlow, extraordinary, beautiful and brilliant and effortlessly composed in the way that some people are, without apparent effort, in every room they walk into. She was on student council. She'd been rumored periodically to be one of the few people Daryl actually spoke to in any sustained way, and as I'd been building my understanding of his world, I'd noticed her name come up twice in passing references he'd made to student council business. I'd filed her away as context. Information. Landscape. I had not apparently filed her away correctly. I found out the way you find out things at Harlow, through the ambient social data stream, specifically through Petra, who had a look on her face when she sat down across from me on Thursday morning that I recognized as the precursor to information I wasn't going to enjoy. "What?" I said. So, she set down her coffee. You know Vanessa Park. I know who she is. Her family and Daryl's family have apparently known each other for years. Their parents are in the same political and professional circles. I looked at her, and the word going around from someone in the student council inner circle who was apparently overheard is that there's been an expectation from both families about the two of them. I was very still. An expectation, I said. Yeah. Petra's voice was careful. She was watching me. The kind that isn't an official arrangement, but is, understood between families. An alignment that everyone's been assuming would formalize at some point. I looked at my coffee cup. Drew, she said. I'm fine, I said. You don't look fine. I'm fine, I said again, more firmly, which meant less convincingly. Peacher put her hand on the table between us but didn't reach across. An offering, not an imposition. I don't know if it's true, she said. It's campus information, which means it's been through at least 3 filters of exaggeration. I thought you should know what was being said. Of course, I said. Of course I should know. I drank my coffee. I ate the rest of my breakfast. I had a very ordinary Thursday and did not think about Vanessa Park and Daryl Cobb and the word expectation and what it meant when a person had already told me they felt like a variable in someone else's equation. I did not think about that at all. I thought about it for 11 consecutive hours. I thought about it while I sat in the quad that Thursday afternoon and waited, and he arrived and sat down, and we worked in the ordinary, comfortable way. And I said nothing about what I'd heard because I didn't know how to, and because it wasn't mine to interrogate, and because the idea of having that conversation and hearing him confirm something devastating felt like a door I couldn't unknow the inside of once I'd walked through. He noticed something was off. Of course he did. He noticed everything. You're not writing, he said. 40 minutes into the session. I'm thinking, I said. You think while writing. This is different. I looked at the fountain. I'm just having a slow afternoon. A pause. He didn't push, but I felt him watching me. That careful, thorough attention. And I was aware that I probably looked exactly like someone sitting inside a feeling they weren't saying. Is there something you want to ask me? He said. I looked at him. What? You've been arranging a question since you sat down. You do that sometimes. Hold something and circle it instead of asking it. Usually you eventually ask. I stared at him. You've been doing it for 40 minutes, he said. It's longer than usual. Am I that obvious? I said, and I meant it as a deflection, but something in my voice came out genuine and a little tired. To me, he said. Simply. I looked at the fountain, at the geese doing their circuits, indifferent and purposeful. I started, stopped, started again. Is there something happening with you and Vanessa Park? The quality of his silence changed, not dramatically, not in a way that most people would have caught. But I knew his silence well enough now to hear the difference between the comfortable kind and the careful kind. What have you heard? He asked. Just what's going around, that there might be an expectation from your families. A pause. There is. 2 words. Flat. True. Okay, I said. It's not, he started, then stopped. You don't have to explain it to me, I said. I want to explain it. I looked at him. He was looking at the fountain, the line of his jaw tight in a way I hadn't seen before. My father and her father have been in each other's circles for years. Since before I was in secondary school, there has been a general understanding between the families that Vanessa and I would be, well, that we'd eventually be together. A pause. It's not arranged. Nothing formal has been said, but it is understood. And you're going along with it, I said. I have been, he said. Going along with it, yes. Have been. Past tense or present. I didn't ask. How does Vanessa feel about it? I asked instead. She's aware of the expectation. She's practical about it. We get along. We have things in common. It's not a hardship as these things go. As these things go. As these things go. I looked at my hands. That sounds like a way of describing something you've decided to accept, rather than something you want. He didn't respond immediately. There are things I want, he said eventually, that don't fit into the equation. I felt that sentence land somewhere specific. Felt the weight of it. Daryl. I don't want to talk about this more right now, he said, quietly, not sharply. He never spoke to me sharply, just firmly, in the way that meant the door was closing and he needed it to. If that's all right. Of course, I said. We didn't talk for the rest of the afternoon. But he didn't leave early. He stayed until the light went the way it always did, until the quad emptied out and the evening cold came in. And when we packed up to go, he stood and said, "Same time next week," in a voice that was quieter than usual, but held. And I said, "Yeah," and we went our separate ways. I walked back to my dorm with the feeling of something important having been almost said and then carefully put away. And I couldn't tell if I was relieved or devastated or some specific color that was both at once. Things I want that don't fit into the equation. I turned that sentence over and over. I slept badly that night and woke up still turning it. November deepened. Campus went into the familiar seasonal tunnel of pre-final stress, and our morning library sessions took on a slightly different quality. More focused, both of us carrying more academic weight. The conversation shorter but no less present. We still talked. We still had the Thursday afternoons. But there was a new undercurrent in things, a new awareness I couldn't completely ignore. The Vanessa Park question hadn't gone away, but I'd made a decision in the days after that conversation that I was going to hold whatever I felt and not let it change what we had, because what we had, this strange, quiet, specific thing we'd built between us, was the most real thing in my life right now, and the idea of jeopardizing it by reaching for something I wasn't sure was reachable was more frightening than the ache of not reaching at all. This was a decision I made very deliberately. It lasted until the evening in the third week of November when I stayed late in the library working on my final research paper, and he walked in at 9:30 at night, saw me at our table, and sat down. "You're here late," he said. "Final paper. Due in 2 weeks and I'm behind." I looked at him. "You?" I needed somewhere quiet. Something in his face was different, not distressed. Daryl didn't do distressed visibly, but compressed, like there was a lot happening behind the surface and he was managing the pressure of it. "What happened?" I asked. A pause. "My father called this evening. I waited. He's announced a run for a higher office. Municipal. He's been building toward it for years." A pause. It changes the stakes, of how I'm supposed to be presenting myself, of what's expected. He stopped. He suggested the Vanessa situation should be clarified, made more formal, before he announces publicly. I held the feeling that arrived in my chest very carefully. "And what do you think about that?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know what I think about it." "That's honest." "I always know what I think about things," he said. "I have strong positions on almost everything. This is the one of the very few things." He stopped. "I can't think about this clearly," which itself tells me something. "What does it tell you?" He looked at me, directly, with the full weight of his attention. "That there's a contradiction in the equation," he said. I held his gaze. "Daryl," I said carefully, "is the contradiction, am I part of the contradiction?" Silence. A long one, the longest we'd had maybe since that first day. "Yes," he said, "just that. One word. Honest and quiet, and the most significant thing he'd said to me in almost 3 months of significant things." I breathed. "Okay," I said. "That doesn't change." "I know," I said. "I know it doesn't change anything. I'm not asking it to." I looked at my hands. I needed to know if I was imagining it. "You weren't imagining it," he said, very quietly. We sat in the library for another 2 hours. We didn't talk about it anymore. We worked, both of us, in the particular quality of charged silence that comes when something true has been said and acknowledged and deliberately set aside, because the world around it hasn't changed shape yet. But when he left, at nearly midnight, both of us finally packing up, he paused at the table. He picked up his bag. He looked at me for a long moment. I'm not good at. He started, stopped, started again. I'm not used to situations where I don't know what the right answer is. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," I said, and I meant it. I meant it completely, because his honesty had cost him something, and I didn't want him to carry guilt for it on top of everything else. "Seriously, don't apologize for telling me the truth." He nodded. "Just once." Then he walked out. I sat in the empty library for a while after he left. The building was quiet. Most people had cleared out by 10. The window table, our table, was lit by the lamp at the end of the row, and I could see the faint marks on the wood where we'd both set our cups every morning for the past 2 months. 2 months. I'd known him for 2 months, and he was the axis around which my days organized themselves. He was already the person I thought about when I read something interesting, because I wanted to know what he'd say about it. He was already the person whose number in my phone I looked at sometimes at night without texting, just aware of the connection. He was already everything I hadn't meant for him to be when I picked up a rolling water bottle and sat in the only empty seat in the library and told myself it was nothing. I put my head in my hands. I was so thoroughly gone on him. And he was gone on me, too. I knew that now. He'd confirmed it. He'd said, yes, you're part of the contradiction. And it didn't fix a single thing. Because the world around us hadn't changed. His father's ambitions hadn't changed. The expectation of Vanessa Park hadn't changed. The architecture of Darrell Cobb's life, so carefully constructed over so many years, hadn't shifted one single degree. There was something between us that was real, and there was everything else. I let myself feel terrible about it for exactly one night. Then I got up in the morning and went to the library and sat at the table and drank my coffee and said good morning and worked in comfortable quiet and pretended for both our sakes that yesterday evening had been a dream. He let me pretend. That was one of the kindest things anyone has ever done for me. December came, and with it the end of semester rush, and somehow, we held steady. We didn't talk about what he'd said in the late-night library. We didn't talk about Vanessa or Gerald Cobb or the announcement or the word formalize. We held the thing between us in a kind of mutual suspension. Both of us aware of it. Both of us carefully not pressing on it, like an injury that's healing and should be prodded. And underneath the suspension, they were good. Genuinely, quietly, sometimes achingly good. The conversations continued and deepened. The understanding between us had a new texture, more honest, more careful, more aware of its own edges. He asked me, one morning in early December, what I was doing over winter break. Going home, I said. My parents are in Vancouver. 2 weeks there, then back here for the intersemester period. I'll be here over winter break, he said. I looked at him. You're not going home. My father has events through most of December. The house will be a pause. A particular kind of full. I prefer to be here. A particular kind of full. I understood this perfectly without needing it explained. I can come back early, I said, before the break ends. If you wanted company. He looked at me. You don't have to do that. I know, I said. I'd want to. A pause. You'd cut your break short to come back to an empty campus in January. I'd come back for the quiet, I said, and because the geese are less territorial in winter, and that bench is actually comfortable when it's yours alone. The almost smile, full and real and unguarded. All right, he said. Come back early. I went home for Christmas, and I didn't tell my parents much about my semester. I told my mother that I'd been doing well academically, which was true. I told my father that I'd made a good acquaintance on campus, which was the most careful and least revealing way I could frame it. My mother, who was perceptive in the way mothers tend to be, heard something in how I said it and looked at me sideways over the Christmas table. An acquaintance? She said. Yes, I said. She looked at my father. My father looked at his turkey. Anyone important? She asked. Just someone I've been spending time with, I said, and then I changed the subject to my sociology grade, which was genuinely excellent and served as a very effective distraction. I came back to campus on January 3rd. The intersemester period was, as I'd expected, quiet. Most students didn't return until the 8th or 9th. The campus had the specific stillness of an institution at rest. Buildings lit, but mostly empty. Pathways clear, the dining hall running on reduced hours with a handful of early returnees and international students who'd stayed. I went to the library on the morning of the 4th. Force of habit, maybe, or something more than habit. He was there. Our table. His chair. His book. 2 coffees. I stopped in the doorway for a second. He looked up when I came through, and his expression, it wasn't the almost smile. It was fuller than that. Something genuine and unguarded moving across his face at the sight of me, something that was there for only a second before he composed himself, but that I caught and held and kept. "You came back early," he said. I said I would. I said. I sat down. I picked up my coffee. He went back to his book. The library was almost empty. The whole campus was almost empty. And the quality of the quiet that morning was different from anything we'd had before. Larger, somehow. More room in it. Like there was no one watching. No ambient social pressure. No eyes tracking who was sitting with whom. Just us. Just this table and this coffee and this silence that had become one of my most treasured places to be. We stayed for 3 hours. We talked more that morning than we usually did. Probably because the emptiness of the building created an acoustic permission, less careful about sound levels. He talked about a paper he'd been reading over break, and I talked about a book I'd found in my parents' house, an old science fiction novel my father had kept since university, and we talked about it for 40 minutes. And I watched him get genuinely excited about an idea, his gestures becoming more expressive, his sentences overlapping themselves in a way I'd never seen from him, this man who was usually so precise and measured, letting a thread of enthusiasm pull him faster than usual. It was the most beautiful thing. I thought it quietly and completely and with full knowledge of what I was doing. He is the most beautiful thing, not just physically, though he was objectively, genuinely difficult to look at without feeling something in your chest reorganize itself, but in his entirety. The way he held the world, the way he used his extraordinary mind and his exhausting memory and his careful attention not to dominate but to understand. The way he'd chosen, out of all the possible ways his life could have gone, to sit in a corner library table and talk to a completely average person from Abbotsford about page 47. I was so in love with him. I let myself know it there in the empty library in the first week of January, and then I put it away again, because knowing it didn't change the equation, and I refused to let my feelings become a burden he had to manage on top of everything else. That was my gift to him in that season. Not saying it, carrying it quietly and showing up every morning and being whatever it was he needed me to be. Friend presence. The one person who asked how he was actually doing and waited through the careful silence for the true answer. That was how I loved him. At a distance that didn't cost him anything, the new semester started and the campus refilled. And things went back to the normal rhythm. But the intersemester week had changed something. We were closer, less careful about the specific distance between us in conversation. He'd started saying things that were more overtly personal, not deep confessions, nothing that cracked the wall, but more of the texture of his actual inner life. Opinions that weren't academic, preferences, small, specific joys that he let out in careful increments. He hated loud music in public spaces. He found documentary films deeply pleasurable in a way he seemed slightly sheepish about. He had a persistent, specific fondness for a particular type of early 20th century architectural design that he couldn't fully explain, except that it felt proportional. This one surprised me, very quietly funny. The humor was dry and understated and arrived without warning and was extraordinarily good when it showed up. "You're funny," I told him one morning after a deadpan observation about a particularly overwrought student council resolution that had made me laugh into my coffee. He looked at me. "I'm not generally described that way. That's because most people don't spend enough time around you to catch it," I said. He considered this. "My sister says the same thing. You have a sister? Younger. By 3 years. She's in secondary school." A pause. The slight softening in his expression that appeared whenever something genuinely mattered. "She's the funniest person I know." This was the first time he'd mentioned her. "What's her name?" I asked. "Amara." A full pause. Full and warm. He seemed to consider how to describe her. Nothing like me. In the best possible way. "She's loud and opinionated and has absolutely no patience for formality. She sounds like the opposite of everything your father wants her to be," I said. A beat. "She's everything my father loves most," he said. "He gives her the latitude he never gave me because she's younger and female and less politically legible as an investment, which is its own kind of inequality." He paused. "But it means she grew up freer, and she's remarkable for it." "Do you resent that?" I asked. He thought about it honestly. "I used to," he said. "Now I'm mostly just glad one of us had it." I looked at him. "You're a good brother." "I try to be." A pause. "She's the person in my family I can." He stopped. "Be honest with?" I offered. A beat. Yes, he said. Maybe that's what I am, I said. A non-family Amara. He looked at me for a moment. Something moved through his expression, something warm and complicated in close. You're not replaceable by a category, he said. I held that sentence in my chest for the rest of the day. February was when things started to shift in a way I couldn't manage anymore. The shift came from multiple directions at once. The way the genuinely difficult things tend to arrive. Not in a single blow, but in a convergence, a set of separate pressures meeting at a point and making something that couldn't be managed individually. The first pressure was simple proximity. We were now spending more time together in a greater variety of contexts. The library still the quad when the weather allowed, occasional evening sessions when we were both in the building at the same time, and it seemed natural to sit together rather than apart. He had started suggesting things, not plans exactly, more like extensions of ongoing conversations, a film screening in the arts building, a department lecture on a topic we'd been arguing about. Small, low-stakes expansions of the space we shared. It looked from the outside like whatever people had been saying it looked like. The second pressure was Vanessa Park. I should say, Vanessa herself was not the problem. The few times I'd encountered her in passing, she was composed and pleasant, genuinely intelligent, the kind of person whose qualities you couldn't object to, even when the circumstances made you wish you could. The problem was what she represented in the architecture of Daryl's life, and the way that architecture was becoming more visible as his father's political ambitions gained momentum. Gerald Cobb's campaign announcement had been made in January. It was a real campaign, resources, staff, media attention, and the way Harlow's campus received it was immediate and significant. Because Gerald Cobb was a known figure in their world, and his run elevated the existing interest in Daryl another several degrees. Daryl handled it with the same careful composure he handled everything. But I could see the weight of it, in the slight compression around his eyes in the mornings, and the texts I occasionally received late at night. Not saying anything distressing, just words, usually about something we'd been discussing, but arriving at midnight or 1 in the morning in a way that told me he wasn't sleeping. I answered every one of them. Always, no matter what time, he noticed. He said once, on a morning after a particularly late exchange, "You don't have to respond immediately." "I know," I said. "You should sleep." "I'm fine." He looked at me. Drew. Daryl. A pause. The almost smile. "Thank you," he said. "You're going to stop thanking me eventually," I said. "I'm going to point out how many times you've said that. Would you like me to stop?" "No," I said honestly. "I'd just like you to know you don't have to earn it." He was quiet. "I'm here because I want to be," I said. "That's it, no transaction." He held my gaze for a long moment. Something in his face that was more open than usual. The wall lowered by what, I wasn't sure. Exhaustion, maybe. Or the accumulated weight of too many weeks of too much expectation. I'm not used to that," he said. "I know," I said. "It takes some adjustment." "Take all the time you need," I said, and I meant it. I meant every word of it. I was prepared to wait indefinitely, to exist in whatever configuration he needed, to be the one constant in a life that seemed otherwise full of variables and obligations. But the third pressure arrived in the second week of February, and it came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. It came from Marcus Chen. Marcus had, over the previous few months, become a peripheral but genuine presence in my life. Not a close friend. I didn't have enough room in my close friend capacity for many people, and that space was thoroughly occupied, but a friendly acquaintance, someone I ate lunch with occasionally, who was funny and socially skilled and had, as it turned out, a genuinely kind heart beneath the network building strategy. He'd been at a student council event in early February. He'd seen something. He sat down at my lunch table on a Wednesday with a look on his face that was trying to be casual and not quite achieving it. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "You're going to tell me regardless," I said. "That's fair." He looked at his hands. "At the mixer last week. The student council cross-department thing. I was there with the athletics liaison. Okay, I saw Daryl there, obviously, and I saw him. There was a moment. With Vanessa Park. Her family had sent something. Flowers, I think, or a card. Something formal and public, related to the campaign. And she received it. And there was this moment where everyone around them was watching and clearly expecting a moment. You know, like a couple moment. And Daryl. He paused. He smiled at her, very correctly, very perfectly. And I was watching from across the room, and I thought, that is the loneliest expression I have ever seen on a person who is technically smiling. I looked at my food, and then he looked up, Marcus continued, and he was scanning the room. Just briefly. And I don't know what he was looking for, but whatever it was wasn't there, and he stopped. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Yeah, you do, I said. A pause. Yeah, he said. I do. I pushed my food around. Is there a point to this information? The point is, he leaned forward slightly. Drew, I've watched you two together for months. I've seen what that looks like. And I've now seen what he looks like when he's in a room doing what's expected of him and you're not there. And those are very different things. Marcus. I'm not trying to, Marcus. I looked at him. Whatever you think you know about what's happening between us, you don't know the whole picture. I know. I know I don't. He held up his hands. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm not trying to manage your feelings or his situation. He stopped. He looked like someone standing in the wrong life is all, and I thought you should know I'd seen it, because I think you probably already knew it. And sometimes it helps to have someone else see it too. I looked at the table for a long time. Thank you, I said, quietly. Sure, he said. He picked up his tray. He was halfway up when I said, Marcus, does he seem okay to you, in general? He paused, thought about it honestly. He seems like someone who is managing a lot of things very well, he said carefully, which is its own kind of answer. He left. I sat in the dining hall alone for a while, someone standing in the wrong life. I didn't want to use Marcus's observation as leverage. I'd told him the truth. He didn't know the whole picture. The whole picture was that Daryl had acknowledged something real existed between us, and had also acknowledged implicitly that the constraints of his life made that real thing unactionable. And I had accepted that. I had chosen to accept it because the alternative was pressure, and pressure was the one thing Daryl's life already had too much of. But the loneliest expression I have ever seen on a person who is technically smiling. I was so tired of watching him be alone in rooms full of people. I didn't say anything. Not that day. Not that week. I gave it space. And then, in the third week of February, everything shifted at once. And not in the direction I'd been managing. It was a Friday evening. I was at a small gathering at a friend of Petra's apartment. Not really my scene, but I'd been persuaded. And honestly, the social contact was good for me after weeks of fairly intensive studying and fairly intensive feelings management. I was having what passed for a good time. A few people I knew, conversation that didn't require too much effort, music at a reasonable volume. And then someone from the student council arrived, a second year I vaguely recognized, and she was mid-conversation with someone else, and I wasn't paying close attention until I heard the name Daryl. I became very still. Actually saw it today, she was saying, outside the administration building. He and Vanessa were. They were standing close, and she put her hand on his arm, and he didn't move away. Like, it looked like something was moving forward there. Her friend said something I didn't catch. Yeah, the first girl said. I think the campaign announcement definitely accelerated something. Her family has been very publicly supportive, and I think it's kind of like things are being formalized. I set down my drink. I found Petra, made an excuse about being tired, and left the party. I walked back to campus in the February cold, and I let myself feel the full extent of what I'd been so carefully managing for months. And it was as bad as I'd been afraid it would be, not sharp like an injury, more like something collapsing from the inside, a structural failure that left everything tilted wrong. I didn't text him. I went home and I lay on my bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought, this is what it costs. This is the tax on choosing to feel something about someone who isn't free to feel it back. The next morning, Saturday, I didn't go to the library. It wasn't a library day. We didn't have a standing Saturday session, so there was nothing to miss. But I noticed the absence of the morning in a way I wouldn't have a few months ago. He texted at 10. His text, "Are you reading anything interesting today?" I stared at it for a long time. I texted back, working through a paper from my methods class. Nothing interesting. He texted, "The Rausch paper on observational methodology. I have notes if you need them." I stared at the screen. He was offering notes on a paper I hadn't told him I was reading, which meant he was either extrapolating from my coursework track or he just paid that much attention. I thought about the party, about Formalize, about her hand on his arm. I typed, "I'm okay, thanks. Brief, not unfriendly. Just less than he was used to from me." A pause on his end, longer than usual. His response, "All right." One word, which for Daryl was the equivalent of a full paragraph of observation about the temperature change in my end of the conversation. I put my phone down. I needed a day. I deserved a day. I'd been carrying this carefully and lovingly and without complaint for months, and I needed one day to be a human being who felt bad about something. I took my day, and then on Sunday morning, I got up and I texted him a genuine question about the paper I was writing, and he responded with a full analytical breakdown that was both infuriating and extremely useful. And we exchanged 12 messages over 2 hours, and by the end of it, I felt not better exactly, but like myself again. Like the version of me that had decided to love him wisely instead of desperately. Monday morning, library. 2 coffees. His chair. The geese through the window. "You were quiet this weekend," he said. "I had a lot on my mind," I said. "Is it something I should know about?" I looked at him. "No," I said. "It's fine." He studied me for a moment. That thorough look. "You're allowed to have things on your mind that aren't about me," he said. "I know, but if this is something that affects—" He paused. "If I've done something, you haven't," I said. "I promise. I just had a moment, and now I'm through it." He held my gaze for another second. Then he nodded, once, and went back to his book. But 10 minutes later, without looking up, he said, "I told my father this week that I needed more time before anything with Vanessa was formalized." I kept my eyes on my laptop. "He wasn't pleased," Daryl continued. "We had an argument. It was—" A pause. It was the most directly I've spoken to him about my own preferences in a long time. "What happened?" I asked. He accepted it. Temporarily. With conditions. He turned a page. "I don't know what I'm doing. I wasn't ready for it to move forward. Not yet." I exhaled very carefully. "Okay," I said. "I needed you to know that," he said. I looked at him. He was looking at his book, his expression giving almost nothing away. But the sentence had been deliberate. He'd needed me to know, not someone else. Not Amara. Me. "Thank you for telling me," I said. He nodded. We worked in silence. But the silence felt different. Something had shifted again. Another fractional, incremental shift in the weight and direction of things. He pushed back against the architecture, slightly, on his own terms, without my asking him to. I didn't let myself make too much of it. But I let myself make a little. March came in with a thaw and a kind of restlessness on campus that felt like collective anticipation. The end of semester on the horizon, the year turning. Everyone slightly giddy with the sense of time moving again after winter's long hold. And something changed in Daryl. I want to describe it accurately because it matters. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden opening or grand shift. It was more like the compression eased. The particular tension he carried that I'd gotten so good at reading began to soften. Not constantly, but in moments. In our mornings, in the Thursday afternoons that now frequently ran into evenings, in the way he'd started occasionally putting down whatever he was working on, to just talk, to tell me something not because it was useful information, but because he wanted to say it. Because he'd thought of me when he thought of it. He was letting himself want things. Small things. Specific things. The kind of small things that accumulate into a life. He told me he used to draw as a teenager. Architectural sketches, mostly floor plans and building facades and imagined structures. He'd stopped in secondary school when his schedule had filled with everything his father wanted him to fill it with. He said he still sometimes dreamed in floor plans. I told him he should start again. "There's no time," he said. "There's always no time," I said. "That's not a real reason." A pause. It would feel pointless now, after years. Pointless like you don't believe in it, or pointless like you're afraid it won't be as good as it was when you were a teenager and that would be disappointing. He looked at me. "The second one," he said. "That's not a reason to not do something. I said. That's just fear wearing a productivity argument. The full smile again, quiet and real. And I'm telling you, even after months of being the periodic recipient of that smile, it still did something catastrophic to my ability to think clearly. You're occasionally very difficult, he said. I've been told, I said. By whom? Petra, my mother. You, just now. Your mother is wise, he said. I laughed. He watched me laugh. And there was something in his expression that I'd started to recognize over the past few weeks as a new thing. A kind of helpless warmth, visible only briefly before he covered it, like he hadn't figured out how to hide it fully yet, like he'd stopped trying quite as hard. The March morning I need to tell you about was the 14th, a Wednesday, which was unusual. We typically had our longer conversations on the mornings with more time, but a Wednesday worked because I didn't have an early class, and he'd apparently shifted a council meeting. He was already there when I arrived, coffee ready. But he was looking out the window instead of reading, which was unusual enough that I noticed immediately. I sat down. Hey, hey, he said. Still looking at the window, I lipped him to it. I got my laptop open and started working and waited for whatever was coming. It took about 20 minutes. Can I tell you something? He said. Always, I said. He looked away from the window. He looked at the table for a moment, then at me, directly, with a kind of resolution I hadn't seen from him before. I've been thinking about the story you wrote, he said, the one I found in the archive. The character who can see the shapes of things but not the things themselves. Okay, I said. I've been thinking about what you said when I asked if it was personal, that someone spoke to you, that was what changed. I was very still. I want to tell you something, and I need you to not. He stopped. Tried again. I need you to let me finish before you say anything. Okay, I said. He exhaled. Just slightly. I have been very careful for a very long time about what I allow myself to want, he said. Not because I don't feel things, because the things I feel don't fit into the life I've been building. They don't fit into my father's equation. They don't fit into who I've been assumed to be. He paused. I've gotten very good at the architecture, the grades and the council and the athletics. I've gotten good at being what everyone needs me to be, and for a long time I thought that was enough. That wanting things for myself was an indulgence I wasn't entitled to. He was looking at the table. Then you sat down, he said. At a table I'd had to myself for 3 years, and I said something to you because I noticed your textbook, and I didn't stop to think about whether it was appropriate. I just said it. He paused. That's not how I function. I don't say things without calculating them first. And then the next morning you came back. And I'd been hoping you would, and I didn't even fully realize I'd been hoping until you walked in and something I didn't have a word for settled in my chest. I wasn't breathing every morning since then, he said. You have been the thing I don't calculate, the one relationship in my life that I have never once managed or performed or curated for an audience. And I don't know what to do with that because I've never had it before and I've been terrified of it and I've been grateful for it and He stopped. I've been in love with you for months and I don't know what to do about it. And I needed to tell you before I lost the nerve. Silence. Absolute silence. The library around us, empty of anyone who would have heard, and the early March light coming through the window and the 2 coffee cups on the table, and Darrell Cobb, not looking at me, his face closed and composed, and behind the composure the most exposed I'd ever seen him. Darrell, I said. He looked up. I've been in love with you since November, I said. Maybe earlier, probably earlier, since you told me what you'd noticed about how I read. Something happened in his face. Something enormous and quiet and so carefully held. November, he said. November, I confirmed. You didn't say anything. Neither did you. I know, I said. I know. I didn't want to be a pressure. I didn't want to be one more thing in your life that cost you something. He was quiet for a moment. You're the only thing in my life that doesn't cost me something, he said. I didn't have a response to that. Not a verbal one. I just looked at him, at this extraordinary, complicated, careful person who had sat in a corner of a library for 3 years, protecting himself from a world that wanted too much of him, and who had looked at me one September morning and decided, for reasons I still couldn't fully account for, that I was worth speaking to. We didn't do anything dramatic. We were in the library. It was a Wednesday morning. There were a few other students starting to arrive at other tables. He reached across the 6 inches of space between us and put his hand over mine on the table. Just that. Just his hand over mine, warm and deliberate. I turned my hand over. Our fingers closed. We sat like that for a long time, working with our free hands, not talking, not needing to, both of us in the specific quiet of two people who have just told the truth after months of careful silence. And it was the best morning of my life up to that point. It was also the beginning of the most complicated period of my life up to that point. But I didn't know that yet. I'm telling the story honestly, which means I have to include the parts that hurt. What came after that morning was about 10 days of the most quietly beautiful existence I have ever lived inside. Nothing changed overtly. We were still careful, still thoughtful about the world around us and the situation and what it meant. We weren't holding hands in the quad or making anything public, but privately, between us, something had been unlocked. The conversations deepened in ways I hadn't thought were possible, given that they were already the deepest conversations I'd had with anyone. He started saying I sometimes, in reference to wanting things, in reference to feeling things, in reference to himself as an entity with preferences and desires that weren't contingent on someone else's needs. It was such a small linguistic shift, and it mattered so enormously. He texted me good morning once. Just good morning. No academic content attached. I saved that text. He sketched something and showed it to me. On a piece of paper from his notebook, a floor plan of somewhere that didn't exist. The kind of imagined architectural space he described having dreamed about. He showed it to me without being asked and without explaining it, and then immediately looked like he was reconsidering showing it to me. It's beautiful, I said. It's just lines, he said. Daryl, it's beautiful. He took it back and folded it carefully and put it in his notebook. But his ears were warm in a way I noted with helpless affection. He came to the Thursday quad session, and instead of sitting on the far end of the bench, he sat close, not touching. We were in public, and we were both still oriented around that careful boundary, but close enough that I was aware of the warmth of him. The Goose conducted 3 territorial campaigns during that session. We narrated them both. It was just good. Simple and ordinary and incandescently good. And then it fell apart. I'm going to tell you what happened as clearly as I can, because clarity matters when the story gets painful. It was the Friday after that Wednesday morning, so maybe 10 days after. I was in the humanities building between classes, waiting for a friend who'd wanted to talk about a group project. Sitting in the common area with my phone out. A second-year student I vaguely recognized. Not a friend, an acquaintance by proximity, sat down nearby and was on a call, and clearly not caring that anyone could hear him. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I was on my phone. But the conversation was loud, and it had a particular word in it that made my attention snag. He was talking about me. Not in a cruel way. That's important to say. He wasn't being malicious. He was just talking, the way people talk on phones in public when they forget other people are present. He was saying something to whoever was on the other end about campus gossip, and the gossip was about Drew Mullen and Daryl Cobb, and the specific version of the gossip had been distorted. The version he was describing wasn't about two people who genuinely cared about each other. It was about someone using access and strategy to get close to the campus king, for the word he used was leverage. Social leverage, career leverage, the implication being that I was close to Daryl because being close to Daryl was useful, and that the whole carefully built morning library window table friendship was a calculated approach by someone ordinary who wanted to benefit from proximity to someone extraordinary. I sat very still. The call ended. The second year left. I sat in the common area for a long time and thought about what I just heard, running it through the filter of 2 semesters of being in Daryl's orbit and thinking about who would be generating this version of events and why. And then I thought about Daryl hearing it, about what it would mean for someone who'd spent 3 years protecting himself from a world full of people who wanted things from him. Someone who'd told me I was the only thing in his life that didn't cost him anything. If someone told him this version, if someone put this version in his ear, the story of Drew Mullen as strategic, calculating, close to him, because of what it offered rather than who he was. I thought about how carefully he'd lowered his walls. I thought about how long it had taken. I thought about what hearing this would do. I needed to tell him. I needed to get ahead of it, to tell him what was being said before it reached him from someone else. I texted him that afternoon and said, "Can we talk tonight? Something's come up." He texted back, "Library at 7." I got there at 7. He was there at 7. His expression was already different, already closed in a way it hadn't been for weeks. He knew. Someone had already gotten there first. "Daryl," I started. "I heard something today," he said. "I know. That's why I texted. I wanted to tell you." "What exactly?" he said. "What specifically are you going to tell me?" His voice was different, not hostile. He still wasn't hostile. That wasn't in him, at least not toward me. But careful again. Sealed. The full architecture back in place between us like it had never come down. "That the thing you heard is wrong," I said. "Whatever version reached you, it's wrong." "The version that reached me," he said evenly, "was that you've been building a relationship with me strategically. That there's social benefit to your being known as the person I speak to. That," he paused, "that you've been performing closeness." "That's not true," I said. "I know it's not true," he said. I stopped. "Then why do you look like?" "Because people are saying it," he said. "Because it exists as a narrative on this campus. Because," he stopped. His jaw was tight. "Because my father's campaign has made everything I do more visible, more scrutinized. And I had," he stopped again, the compression back, worse than before. "I had allowed myself to believe that this was private, that what was happening between us was ours, not a subject for. It was ours," I said. "It is." "Is it?" He looked at me. "Because the version of it that's circulating apparently has quite a bit of detail. Details that suggest the people producing this narrative were paying very close attention to something they shouldn't have had access to." I looked at him. "I haven't talked about us to anyone. I've been protective of this the whole semester. Petra knows we're friends. She doesn't know anything beyond that." He was quiet. "I haven't told anyone anything personal," I said. "I wouldn't. You have to know that." "I know that," he said, and he sounded exhausted. "I believe you. I do believe you, Drew." "Then, the problem isn't whether I believe you," he said. "The problem is that this narrative exists, and it's circulating, and it includes enough observable detail that it's plausible to people who don't know the truth. And the problem is..." He stopped. His voice had gone very quiet. "The problem is that my father's going to hear it. He hears everything on this campus. And when he hears it, the conversation that follows is going to be... I don't know if I'm prepared for that conversation right now." I looked at him, at the exhaustion in his face, the weight of it, at the careful, composed, devastating evidence of someone trying to hold too many things at once. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm so sorry this is landing on you. You don't need to apologize." "I know. But I am." I took a breath. "What you need, right now?" "What would help?" He looked at me for a long moment, and something moved across his face, something that wanted to reach toward me and was stopped by everything around it. "I need some time," he said, "to think." I nodded. "Okay. Not." He stopped. "Not because I don't, Drew. Not because of anything about my feelings." "I know," I said. "I just need to think clearly, and right now I can't think clearly when you're..." He stopped again. "When I'm what?" I wanted to ask. "When I'm here, when I'm close, when the walls have been down long enough that I've become something he can't think around." I didn't ask. I nodded again. I picked up my bag. "Take the time you need," I said. "I'll be at the table Monday." He looked at me. "I'll be at the table Monday," I repeated. "That doesn't change." Something in his face, just at the edge of it, softened. "All right," he said. I walked out. I walked out of the library and across the campus, and I didn't cry. I didn't cry. I was absolutely not going to cry on the path between the library and the dormitory buildings. And I got to my room, and I sat on my bed, and I held the whole enormous weight of it. And then I did cry, quietly into my pillow, because I am a human being, and some things hurt. The weekend was difficult in the particular way that waiting is difficult. I texted him nothing because he'd asked for space and I was going to give it, even though every time my phone lit up I felt something jolt in my chest before I registered it wasn't him. Petra knew something was wrong. She showed up at my door on Saturday with food and the kind of presence that doesn't demand anything. And we watched a film, and she didn't ask, and I didn't say. And by the end of the evening, I felt fractionally more like a person. Is it about Daryl? She said when she was leaving. Partially, I said. She nodded. Is it bad? I don't know yet, I said honestly. Okay, she said. I'm here. I know, I said. Thank you. She hugged me and left. I stood in the doorway for a minute. Monday morning, I went to the library. I got there before him. I sat in my seat. I had 2 coffees from the cart, both of them. He came in at 7:45. He stood at the edge of the row for a second, and I looked up, and we just looked at each other. He came and sat down. He picked up his coffee. Thank you, he said. Of course, I said. We worked. We didn't talk about Friday. We didn't resolve anything. But he was there, and I was there, and the 6 inches of space between us felt, this morning, like something chosen rather than maintained. It was something. It was enough. For now, the difficult part, the real test, arrived at the end of March. I want to explain the lead-up, because context matters. The campus gossip about us had continued to circulate in the weeks after that Friday conversation, neither confirming nor denying itself, the way campus gossip tends to sustain itself on ambiguity. Daryl and I had found a kind of careful equilibrium, still present with each other, still genuine, but with a new consciousness of the audience. Less physically close in public, more guarded in conversation when other people might overhear, picking up exactly where Drew's story left off. Same voice, no breaks, carrying through to the ending. It felt like a retreat, and I hated it. Not because of anything Daryl did. He was present. He was consistent. He texted me the same late-night observations about whatever he was reading. He had the coffee ready every morning. He showed up on Thursdays, but there was a new carefulness in how he moved through our shared space, a new monitoring of angles, and I understood it. I did understand it, and still found myself grieving the 10 days we'd had before the gossip reached us. Those 10 days when he'd sat close on the bench and held my hand across a library table and sketched a floor plan and showed it to me without thinking twice. I wanted those 10 days back. I couldn't have them. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. And the gap between what existed and what I wanted was getting harder to live inside with grace. The lead up to the real test was a student council public event. The annual spring forum where the council presented initiatives to the wider university community. It was a big deal in Harlow's academic calendar. Genuinely attended, professionally organized, and Daryl was the president and the visible face of it. I went because Petra wanted to go, and I figured I owed her at least one institutional event after she'd spent the semester doing me emotional favors. I wasn't going because of Daryl. I was absolutely not going because of Daryl. Petra gave me a look when I showered and wore a decent shirt. For the forum, I said. Of course, she said. The forum was held in the main auditorium, and it was, objectively, impressive. The council had prepared well, clear presentations, genuine substance, well-handled Q&A, and Daryl ran it with the composed authority that I'd spent months watching him deploy. The public version of himself that was so polished and so removed from the person I knew in the library that seeing them in the same body still gave me a slight cognitive dissonance. He was extraordinary at this. I mean that with full honesty and zero bitterness. He was articulate and precise. And when someone in the audience pushed back on a policy point, he navigated it so elegantly that the person who'd been challenging him ended up looking like they were agreeing. He was built for this. Whether he'd chosen it or been built for it by design, it fit him like a second skin. I watched from the 4th row. I was proud of him in a way that had nothing to do with what existed between us and everything to do with simply knowing him. This person. This specific, extraordinary, complicated person. Vanessa Park was in the front row. I saw her from my seat, composed and composed and composed, which seemed to be her defining characteristic. She was watching the forum with the particular attentiveness of someone who was invested in its success. At one point near the end, she caught Daryl's eye from the front row and gave him the small nod that meant, well done. And he received it with the correct and professional acknowledgement that told me nothing about what he felt, and everything about how well he'd learned to give away only what was controlled. The loneliest expression I've ever seen on a person who is technically smiling. Marcus's words arrived in my head without invitation. I told them to leave. they didn't. After the forum, there was a reception in the atrium. I was going to leave. I planned to leave. But Petra got talking to someone from her political science cohort, and I found myself standing with a drink I didn't want near the edge of the room, watching the post-event social dynamics with the detached observation of someone who has spent too much time in a library thinking about human behavior. And then Daryl found me. Not found in the dramatic sense. He walked toward me with a specific directness that meant he'd located me with intention and was moving on purpose, past other people who tried to catch his eye or fall into his path. Past Vanessa, who looked up from a conversation and tracked him for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read. He stopped in front of me. "You came," he said. "Petra wanted to come," I said. "Right," the almost smile. "And the shower and the shirt?" I looked at him. "You noticed." "I noticed everything," he said. "Always." We were standing closer than we had been in weeks. The room was full enough that it wasn't conspicuous. Or at least I was telling myself it wasn't. And he had the particular quality of presence that meant he was genuinely here, not in Papa Daryl mode, but in something closer to the library version of himself. "You were great up there," I said. "It went well," he said. "Standard deflection. Daryl." "You were great." He held my gaze. "Thank you." The policy section on campus mental health resources was strong. The counter-argument you anticipated in the second question was exactly right. "I knew that question was coming from the third row," he said. "She submitted a written comment 3 weeks ago, with the same framework." "You remembered her written comment from 3 weeks ago." "I remember things," he said. "Everything," I agreed. The warmth in the air between us, careful and present, and ours, even here in a room full of people, even carefully managed. Ours. "Can we—" He stopped, looked around once, quickly. "Can you stay until the reception clears?" "I'd like to talk." "Yeah," I said. "Of course." He moved back into the room. I watched him go, watched him fold back into the public architecture effortlessly, and I stood with my drink and waited. Petra found me 40 minutes later, and I told her she could go. I was catching up with someone, and she looked at where Daryl was standing across the room and back at me and said absolutely nothing, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done. By 9, the room had mostly cleared. A few council members were stacking chairs. Vanessa was in conversation with the faculty advisor, and Daryl was doing his final presidential duties, thanking the venue staff, confirming logistics with the council secretary. When the last of it was done, he crossed the room to where I was sitting on the edge of the stage, waiting. He sat beside me. Not his usual careful distance. Close. "I've been talking to Amara," he said. "Your sister?" "Yes." He looked at his hands. "She came up for the weekend." "She does, sometimes. My father doesn't know. She uses the excuse of a friend in the city." He paused. She's very direct about things. It's one of the things I've always loved and occasionally been frightened by." "What did she say?" A pause. "She said she's known since she was 14 that I was." He stopped. Started again. "Then I'm gay." "She said she's been waiting for me to say it out loud to her for 3 years. She said she was starting to lose patience." The faintest trace of something in his voice. Not quite amusement, but close to it. The warmth he reserved for Amara even in difficult sentences. I was very still. "She said it like it was the most ordinary thing," he continued. "She said she knows about you. Not details. I hadn't told her anything specifically. But she'd seen my face when I talked about what I'd been reading, and somehow—" He stopped. "She said she'd seen my face when I mentioned you. I didn't trust my voice, so I said nothing. She was right," he said. "About all of it. She has always been." He paused. "She's always known me better than I've known myself. I think I've been waiting for someone to say it simply enough that I couldn't complicate it anymore. And Amara doesn't know how to be anything other than simple about what's true." "Daryl," I said. "I haven't told my father," he said. "I'm not ready for that. I don't know when I'll be ready for that. The timing and the campaign and everything around it means that that conversation will be significant, and I'm not." He shook his head. "I'm not there yet. And I can't promise you a timeline. I can't promise you anything neat or resolved about how this unfolds." "I'm not asking for that," I said. "I know you're not." He looked at me. "That's part of what makes you Drew. You have never asked me for anything I couldn't give. You've just been there every morning, And I don't want to keep asking you to wait in that particular way. In the careful, managed, protected way. I don't want that to be what this is. What do you want it to be? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Honest, he said. I want it to be honest. I looked at him, at his hands, clasped together in his lap, at the slight tension in his jaw that was the physical signature of him saying something that cost him, at his profile in the half-lit atrium, the forum chair stacked in rows behind us, the late March evening outside the tall windows. Then let it be honest, I said. He turned to look at me. It doesn't have to be resolved, I said. The situation with your father and the campaign and the Vanessa expectation. None of that needs to be resolved tonight for this to be honest. Honest just means you stop pretending to me that you don't feel what you feel. And I stop pretending that I'm fine being only in the configuration that's most convenient. Is this hard for you? He asked. Being in this situation with me? Sometimes, I said. Yes, sometimes it's hard. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, I said. I chose this. I'm choosing it right now. I just wanted you to know that choosing it is a choice I'm making, not a state I'm in automatically. He held my gaze. I don't want to make things difficult for you, he said. You make things complicated, I said. That's not the same as difficult. Is it a distinction you're comfortable with? It's a distinction I'm willing to live inside, I said. For now, as long as we're honest about what it is. Silence. And then, in the empty atrium, with nobody left to see and nothing left to manage, he leaned sideways until his shoulder was against mine. Not a dramatic gesture, just contact. Warmth. Two people being honest about the fact that they wanted to be close. I leaned back. We sat like that for a while without talking, the building settling around us. The windows going full dark outside. I've been drawing again, he said. At night, floor plans. I know, I said. You've got graphite on your right hand most mornings. A pause. Then that sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was the thing that lived next to one. Of course you noticed, he said. I notice things, I said. Not everything, but the things that matter. He was quiet for a moment. You matter, he said. Very simply, very directly, without qualification. You matter to me too, I said. We stayed until the building manager came to lock up, and then we walked out into the March night and parted ways. At the path junction, with nothing dramatic between us. No kiss, no declaration, no resolution of the complicated machinery of his life. Just the ordinary miraculous fact of two people walking in the same direction for a while. I went home and I felt, for the first time in weeks, like the ground was mostly under my feet. April. April was when the real collapse happened, and I want to be precise about the sequence of events, because the sequence matters. April 1st, Gerald Cobb came to campus. Not for Daryl specifically, or not only for Daryl specifically. He was speaking at a political science department event, part of a series on local governance that the department ran annually. He was an obvious choice given the campaign. The event was ticketed and the tickets had been gone in 2 hours, which told you something about the appetite for political access at a school full of aspiring policy professionals. I didn't go. I had no desire to be in the same room as Gerald Cobb, which was partly instinctive and partly a very specific kind of protectiveness. Daryl hadn't mentioned his father's visit much, just acknowledged it once with a particular quality of controlled neutrality that told me the prospect was complicated. But things that happen in rooms you're not in can still reach you. Daryl didn't text that evening, which was unusual. I told myself he was occupied with his father's visit. I went to bed at a reasonable hour and woke up to a text sent at 2:17 AM. It said, "My father knows." I stared at my phone for about 4 seconds. Then I was fully awake. I typed back, "Knows what?" Specifically, a long pause. Then, about me, and about you. I sat up in bed. Me? How? Him? Someone at the forum. Someone who was watching and apparently has an opinion about my father's campaign interests and thought he should know that his son's, the message cut off there, started again. Him. That his son had been developing a significant relationship with another male student. And that the nature of that relationship was inconsistent with the family's public positioning. I held the phone. Me? Are you okay? A pause. Him. No. Him. We had a long conversation tonight. He's not cruel about it. I want to be accurate about that. He's not unkind. He has a version of himself that he believes in, and he has a version of me that he's built and invested in, and in his mind, that version doesn't. Another pause. Him. He said he needed me to be careful. About my public positioning, about what associations I was developing, about protecting the campaign. Me, he said that? Him? More or less. Me, Daryl. Him, I know. Me, that's not okay. Him, I know that too. I just don't have it. I don't have a clear response yet. I told him I needed time to think. He gave me the week. The week! Like an ultimatum with a deadline, dressed in reasonable language. Me, where are you right now? Him, library. Me, I'm coming. Him, Drew, it's 2 in the morning. Me, I know, I'm coming. I threw on clothes. I walked across the empty campus in the April night, the cold still sharp enough to make my breath visible. And I went to the library, which was technically 24 hours during exam prep season. And he was there at our table, no coffee, no book open, just sitting in the way that meant he was very far inside himself. I sat down. He looked at me. In the low library light, the composition was held, but barely. The architecture was doing its job, but only just. You didn't have to come, he said. I know, I said. We sat in silence. I've been trying to think clearly about this, he said eventually, to identify the logical sequence of actions, what the options are, and which ones are sustainable. You don't always have to think logically about things, I said. If I don't, he said, I'll feel it, and right now, if I feel it fully, I'm not sure I'll be able to hold it together. I looked at him. You don't have to hold it together here. Drew, you don't, I said. Not with me. I've never needed you held together. Something shifted in his face. The composition cracked slightly just at the edges, and then he put his head down, his arms on the table, and was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Not crying. I didn't think he was crying, just letting himself be undone, very slightly, in the safest place available. I put my hand on his arm, left it there. We stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, he sat up. He looked at me, directly, with something raw still visible that he hadn't yet managed to cover back over. I've spent my whole life trying to be what he needed me to be, he said, not because I was afraid. Or not only because I was afraid, because I love him. Because he's worked for 20 years towards something he genuinely believes in, and I've genuinely wanted to support that. And now He stopped. Now I'm the thing that complicates it. You're not a complication, I said. You're his son. That's supposed to come first. In his mind, Daryl said quietly, those two things are not in conflict. He hasn't built a framework where they're in conflict. That's not. He paused. He hasn't let himself know me, the actual me, well enough to see the contradiction. And that might be the worst part of tonight. Not what he said, but realizing how thoroughly I've hidden myself. For years, for his benefit and mine both. I looked at him. You don't have to hide anymore, I said. Not from me. I know, he said. I know that. And He stopped. Something moved through his face. I don't know what I would have done this semester without you. I'm aware of how significant that is. I'm aware of what He shook his head. I haven't been fair to you. What do you mean? I've been allowing you to be close to me while also being unable to offer you the clarity you deserve. The openness. I've let you exist in a situation that has cost you things socially and hasn't been. Stop, I said. He looked at me. I'm a grown person who made choices, I said. I chose to sit at this table every morning. I chose to bring you coffee. I chose to come to the library at 2 in the morning. Not because you asked me to. Because I wanted to. I looked at him. Don't take that from me by making it about what you owe me. I'm not a debt. He was quiet. You're the opposite of a debt, he said. And his voice had something in it, something careful and close. Then stop doing the math, I said. Stop calculating what's fair and what's owed and what's been cost. We're just here. That's enough for tonight. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. We stayed in the library until almost 4 in the morning. We talked a little more, about smaller things, easier things, The comfortable conversational ground we'd built, about the geese, about the floor plan he'd drawn the previous week that he'd been thinking about developing further, about a film we'd both mentioned wanting to see. When we finally left, walking out into the pre-dawn campus, he stopped at the path junction. "Drew," he said. "Yeah, thank you." A pause. "I know you said you don't need the thanks. I know you mean that, but I need to say it anyway. Because what you've given me this semester, what you've given me tonight, I don't have a word for it that's adequate. So thank you is the best I have." I looked at him in the dark, in the April cold, this person I had not been planning to love and had loved anyway, with the helpless completeness of something that happens to you rather than something you arrange. "Get some sleep," I said. He exhaled, something almost like a laugh. "Good night, Drew," he said. "Good night," I said. We walked in opposite directions. The week his father gave him did not go cleanly. That's the honest account of it. I want to tell you it resolved clearly that Darrell stood in front of his father and said the thing, and the world reorganized itself around that honesty. But the truth is that life doesn't move that neatly, and Darrell was a person with a complex relationship to his own needs and a genuine, unresolved love for a father who had shaped him in ways he was still mapping. What happened in the first week of April was this. Darrell and his father talked again, multiple times. I knew this from the quality of the late-night texts, from the way our morning sessions carried a different weight, from the particular exhaustion in his face on the days when a call had happened. And somewhere in the middle of that week, something else happened. Vanessa Park came to find me. She appeared at the door of the library study room where I was working on a Tuesday afternoon. She knocked, which was more courteous than most people manage. I looked up. She looked at me with an expression that was composed and also something more complicated than composed underneath. "Can I sit down?" she said. "Sure," I said. She sat across the table from me. She put her bag down. She folded her hands. She looked at me in a way that reminded me slightly of the way Darrow looked at things, measured and complete and not in a hurry. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay," I said. "Does he love you?" I stared at her. "I'm not asking to cause trouble," she said. "I'm not angry. I'm genuinely asking because I need to understand the actual situation rather than the version of it that everyone around me has opinions about." I looked at the table. "That's a question you should ask him." "I did," she said. I looked up. "He didn't answer it directly," she said, which for Darrell is a more honest answer than most people's direct answers. She paused. "So I'm asking you, because I think you will be honest with me if I ask you directly, and because you have the kind of face that doesn't lie easily." I held her gaze for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I think he does." She was quiet. "And you love him," she said. "Yes," I said. She nodded. Slowly. "Then the situation I've been waiting for my entire adult life to resolve itself," she said, "was never actually a situation. It was a story other people were telling about me. I didn't say anything. I've known Darrell since we were teenagers," she said. We've always been kind to each other. We have things in common. I understand his world in ways that most people don't. Because our worlds are adjacent." She paused. "I've also known for most of that time that whatever he felt for me, it didn't have what you just described. What the two of you apparently have." "Vanessa, I'm not devastated," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not heartbroken." She paused. "I'm relieved, actually, which tells me more about the situation than anything else could." She looked at me. "What I am is a little angry at the people around us, his father, my father, who had been building a structure around two people for years without asking either of us what we actually wanted." "I understand that," I said. "I know you do," she said. She looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know what you're hoping for. I don't know what happens next with his family or the campaign or any of it. But I want you to know that I'm not a barrier. I never was. And if there's anything I can do to make this less complicated, I'm willing to." I stared at her. "Why would you do that?" I asked. She considered. "Because he deserves better than what everyone has been planning for him," she said. "And because I do too." A pause. "And because you came here and made him a person who smiles, and that seems like it should count for something." She stood. She picked up her bag. "He knows I came to talk to you," she said. I told him I was going to. He didn't stop me. She paused at the door. Take care of him. She left. I sat in the study room for a long time. He knew she was coming. He'd let her. He was, in his careful, precise, indirect way, doing something, arranging truth, letting things come into contact with each other that needed to be in contact, not resolving it himself yet. He wasn't ready for that, but creating the conditions. He was moving towards something. I didn't text him that day. I let it be. I let whatever he was working through have the room it needed. The next morning, library. Coffee. Silence. After about 20 minutes, he said, Vanessa talked to you. She did. She's Dart. He paused. She's an extraordinary person. She really is, I agreed. She told my father, he said, quietly, that she wasn't going to participate in an expectation she hadn't agreed to, that she had her own life and her own choices to make, and that she needed him to stop including her in the planning without consultation. A pause. She apparently said it in exactly those words. Good for her, I said. It has made things more visible, he said. My father is asking questions, he's not being unkind, but the questions are ones I've been avoiding for a long time. Are you ready to answer them? I asked. A long pause. I don't know, he said honestly. I think I might be. I looked at him. Whatever happens. Whatever he says, you know that doesn't change anything about who you are. Intellectually, I know that, he said. Emotionally. He stopped. It's harder. I know. He spent 20 years. He stopped again. His jaw tight. He will be disappointed, and the sense of a specific version of his future becoming impossible. And I find that I care about that more than I want to, which is irrational. It's not irrational, I said. He's your father. You love him. You don't have to stop caring about his feelings in order to also believe that your own life belongs to you. Silence. Both things can be true, I said. He looked at me. That's what you said about the incompatible truths. It applies. Living honestly inside the conflict, he said. Yeah. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he exhaled and looked at the window and said, I called Amara last night. How did that go? The almost smile. Fully arrived, fully real. She said I'd taken 3 years too long, and she was starting to wonder if she needed to do it for me. She sounds amazing, I said. She's 15, and she's the most direct human being I've ever encountered, he said. She said, he paused, something warm and slightly undone in his expression. She said she just wanted me to be happy. That was all. That was the full content of her position. I felt something in my chest that was so large and tender I didn't know what to do with it. Smart kid, I said. The smartest person I know, he said. After. He stopped. I looked at him. After you, he said. I looked at my coffee cup because I needed to look at something that wasn't his face. You're biased, I said. I'm precise, he said. There's a difference. The conversation his father required happened on the third Saturday of April. I know this because Daryl told me it was happening. Not the details in advance, but the fact of it. Told me on the Friday before, at the library, with the particular composure that he wore when he was frightened and not going to show it. My father is coming up tomorrow, he said. We're having a proper conversation. Okay, I said. Are you ready? No, he said. But I'm going. I looked at him. Whatever happens, you're still you. I know, he said. I'm going to try to remember that. Call me after, I said, if you want. Doesn't matter what time. He looked at me for a moment. Then, all right, Saturday was the longest day I've ever spent doing nothing. I worked on a paper, I went for a walk, I texted Petra a nonsense question just to have something to do with my hands. I tried to read 4 different things and finished none of them. I watched the geese through the window of the campus coffee shop and thought about Daryl in a room with his father. The careful architecture of his lifetime meeting the person he actually was, and I felt the enormity of that with the specific ache of someone who can't go with the person they love to the thing that scares them most. At 7:43 in the evening, my phone rang, his name on the screen. I picked up before the second ring. Hey, I said. Silence for a moment. Then, hey. His voice was not wrecked, not broken, but carrying something large that had moved through him and left a mark. "Are you okay?" I said. "I think so," he said. "I will be." A pause. It was. It was a long conversation. "Was it bad?" "Parts of it," he said. He was. He was not what I feared. Not fully. He was hurt and confused. He has a lot of questions that he hasn't fully formed yet. He said things that weren't. He paused. He said things that were painful, not cruel, but painful. "I'm sorry," I said. He also said, a pause. He also said he needed time, that he loved me and that he needed time to understand. Those were his exact words. His voice did something complicated on the word loved. I held the phone and didn't say anything, because sometimes the right response to something is just to be present with it. "He didn't walk away," Daryl said. "He's upset, and he doesn't understand, and he has a campaign to manage, and I've made things considerably more complicated for him, and he knows it, and I know it. But he didn't walk away. That matters," I said. "Yes," he said. "It does." A pause. "He asked about you." I stilled. "He'd heard things," Daryl said. "From the person who told him initially, and from it doesn't matter, he'd heard the version that wasn't fair to you. And I corrected it." Another pause. "I told him who you are. Not strategically. Not as a performance of stability or respectability or whatever he would have wanted to hear. I just told him. I told him that you were the first person in my adult life who had made me feel like myself was something worth being." I was quiet for a long time. "What did he say?" I asked. "He didn't say much. He was absorbing a lot of things at once." A pause. "But he asked your name. He asked it like he was filing it, like it was information he intended to hold." I breathed. "Daryl," I said. "Yeah, I'm proud of you." A long silence. "I'm terrified," he said. "I know, and I feel." He stopped. "I feel lighter," which makes no sense given that everything is more complicated now than it was this morning. "It makes complete sense," I said. "That's what happens when you stop carrying something that wasn't yours to carry." He was quiet. "I'd like to see you tomorrow," he said. "Library," I said. 8 o'clock. Coffee's on me." "I know it is," he said. "It always is." Something in his voice that was almost the audible version of that smile. "Get some sleep," I said. "You too," he said. I stayed on the phone for a second after I said goodbye, listening to the end of the call, the click of disconnection, and then the quiet of my room. And I sat with everything I was feeling, the fear and the hope and the tenderness, and the awareness that we were in the middle of something that wasn't over, that the road ahead was still long and not fully visible. And I let myself be grateful. Just grateful. For the person he was. For the choice he'd made today. For the fact that I'd sat in the wrong chair on the right morning and picked up a rolling water bottle and ended up here. I slept better than I had in weeks. The last month of semester was not resolution. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't a clean ending. Gerald Cobb did not transform into an ideal father. The campaign did not pause. The complexity of Daryl's life did not simplify because one honest conversation had happened. Things were in progress, which is the only honest way to describe real life. But something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted in the architecture, and the shift was permanent. He started showing up differently, not dramatically, not in a way that rewrote the visible surface of his life, but in the increments I'd come to speak fluently. He laughed more, and not the careful, controlled almost laugh, but the real one that I heard for the first time one morning when I told him what the goose had done to a first-year student's unattended bagel while the student was oblivious on his phone. The laugh came out before he could catch it, loud and surprised and deeply undignified and absolutely perfect. He looked startled by his own laugh. I looked at him like he'd handed me something precious, which he had. "You should do that more often," I said. "Laugh at bagel theft?" he said. "Laugh," I said. He looked at me, something in his face that had no management left in it, just warmth, direct and unguarded and entirely his. "I'm working on it," he said. He started drawing in the mornings sometimes, not instead of studying, alongside it, small sketches in the margins of his notebook. floor plans and building facades, and, once, what appeared to be a bench with 2 people sitting on it and 3 geese nearby, rendered in very precise detail. I didn't comment on it. I just noticed it and felt something enormous and quiet in my chest. He told Marcus Chen, one afternoon in late April, that he'd be glad to have a direct working conversation about the athletics joint project. Not because I'd asked him to, I found out later, because he'd decided he was done managing his social existence entirely through avoidance. Marcus texted me about it with about 14 exclamation points, which I felt was a proportionate response. He stopped monitoring the distance between us in public, not in a flagrant way, not in a way that required anyone to respond to it before he was ready for those responses. But when we walked between the library and the quad on a Thursday afternoon and my shoulder bumped his, he didn't adjust away. He just walked. Close. And one evening in the last week of April in the library that had been the center of our entire world for 8 months, we stayed later than usual. And when I finally started packing up and said I should go, he said, "Wait." And I waited. And he sat there for a moment with something working itself out in his face. And then he said, "I want to do this properly." "Do what properly?" I said. "Whatever this is," he said. "Whatever it's becoming, I want to take you somewhere. Not the quad, not the library. Somewhere that's a choice we make together, rather than a coincidence of proximity." I looked at him. "Are you asking me out?" I said. He held my gaze, and I watched him not deflect, not redirect, not calculate the sentence before it arrived. I watched him just look at me and say, "Yes." "Okay," I said. "Okay. Yes, Daryl." I felt myself smiling. "Okay," he exhaled, something releasing. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," I agreed. He picked up his bag. He walked to the end of the row and then stopped, exactly as he had on a Thursday afternoon in October, his back to me, and said, "Drew." "Yeah," I said. A pause. Not the same pause as October. This one was different. Fuller. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for months," he said. "And I think I've been waiting until I could say it without qualifications, without all the but and the however and the I need more time. Just cleanly." I didn't move. He turned around. "I love you," he said. That's the whole sentence. No qualifications. The library was quiet around us. The lamp at the end of the row. The window with the campus dark outside it. The marks on the table where 2 coffee cups had sat every morning for 8 months. "I know," I said. "I've known for a while." "I know you have," he said. "You know everything about me." "Not everything," I said. "I'm still learning." "So am I," he said. "Myself, mostly." A pause. "With some help." "Some," I agreed. He looked at me for a long moment. That thorough, examining look that had first landed on me on a September morning and had been, in retrospect, the beginning of everything. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," I said. He left. I sat at the table alone for a while, my bag packed and my coat on, and no reason left to be there except that I wanted to stay for a moment in the place where we'd built everything, where it had started with a water bottle and a textbook error and 6 inches of space and 2 people both looking for quiet. I put my hand flat on the table, just for a moment. Then I picked up my bag and I walked out into the April evening. And the air was warm. Finally, actually warm. The real spring warmth that comes after a long winter and feels like a physical relief. I walked back across campus. I thought about Saturday, thought about all the Saturdays after it, all the mornings, all the conversations I hadn't had yet with the person who remembered everything and noticed the shapes of my thoughts and had been waiting. Both of us, I understood now, had been waiting for something that didn't ask them to be smaller than they were. I thought about Amara, 15 years old and impatient and right about everything, who'd looked at her brother and seen the truth and said, "I just want you to be happy." I thought about Petra, who'd asked me in September if I was falling for him and had seen the answer in my face before I'd admitted it to myself. I thought about Vanessa Park and Take Care of Him, and a relief she hadn't expected to feel. I thought about Marcus Chin and the loneliest expression I've ever seen on a person who is technically smiling, and how that expression had been the thing I most wanted to undo. I thought about page 47 and a rolled water bottle, and the particular quality of a library corner at 8 in the morning. And I thought about Daryl Cobb, the real one, not the campus king, not Gerald Cobb's investment, not the face on the brochure. The one who dreamed in floor plans and laughed at geese and carried everything alone because he never had anywhere to put it down. The one who noticed things he didn't want to remember and paid attention so thoroughly that it exhausted him and used all of it not to dominate or impress, but to understand. The one who'd sat beside nobody for 3 years and then sat beside me. The one who'd looked at a completely average person from an ordinary Tuesday morning and decided, for reasons I would spend a long time trying to understand and eventually accept, were simply what they were. Decided that I was worth speaking to, worth knowing, worth loving. I've thought a lot since then about why he chose me. I don't mean that in a self-deprecating way. I'm not fishing for reassurance from a moment that's long past. I mean, I've genuinely thought about it. The way you think about the things that change the shape of your life, what it was about me specifically that made this specific, extraordinary, guarded person decide to crack a door he'd kept sealed for years. I've asked him, actually, more than once. He gives different answers depending on the day, which I think is the truest answer of all. That it wasn't one thing that had accumulated, that the reasons are multiple and interwoven, and some of them even he can't fully articulate. But the one he comes back to most often is this: I didn't want anything from him. Not his status or his access or his father's network. Not a story to tell or a connection to leverage. I sat beside him on a Tuesday morning because it was the only open seat, and I treated him like a person because he was one. And I asked questions because I was curious about the answers and not because curiosity was a strategy. And in a life that had been full of people who wanted things from the version of him he'd built, the experience of someone wanting nothing from him except exactly what he chose to give, that was apparently the thing. The rest followed from that. I think about that sometimes, and I feel something that's both humbling and clarifying. That the most meaningful relationship of my life started not from anything impressive I did, not from courage or brilliance or calculated approach, but from the simple, ordinary act of treating someone like they were worth being treated honestly. That's what I had to offer. That was enough. The spring semester ended. Gerald Cobb continued his campaign navigating what I can only imagine was a significant internal recalibration, with a conversation between him and his son that I was not present for, but that Daryl described to me afterward as the hardest and most important thing he'd ever done. It didn't resolve everything. Some things between them are still being worked out carefully in the way that things between parents and children who love each other across a significant understanding gap tend to be worked out. Slowly, with setbacks, with more patience than either party finds natural. But Gerald Cobb met me for the first time at a family dinner in August, at Daryl's insistence and Amara's enthusiastic logistical support. He was formal, careful, a man who was genuinely trying to hold a new understanding while managing the considerable other weight of his public life. He called me by name, which Daryl had told me meant something. He asked me one careful question about my degree. I answered honestly and briefly, and we managed a full dinner in civil and occasionally genuine company. Amara sat across from me and gave me a look that was deeply eloquent and almost made me laugh at the table. At the end of the evening, in the driveway, Gerald Cobb shook my hand with the particular gravity of a man who is doing something he's still deciding how to feel about. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Daryl tells me you've been a good friend to him." He said friend. I let it be friend for that evening, because we were still in the middle of things, and the middle requires patience. He's been a good friend to me, I said. Gerald Cobb nodded once, the way his son nods, complete and economical and meaning more than it shows. He got in his car. I stood in the driveway with Daryl, and Amara was in the doorway behind us. And when his father's car turned out of the driveway, she said, at full volume, "That went significantly better than I expected." Daryl looked at her. "Thank you for your assessment, Amara." "Any time," she said cheerfully, and went back inside. I looked at Daryl. He looked at me. Something in his face that was tired and relieved and real. "First of many," I said. "First of many," he agreed. "It gets easier. How do you know?" "Because hard things get easier," he said. "I'm starting to believe that." I took his hand. We stood in the driveway in the August evening, the suburban quiet around us, a few stars visible, the house behind us with the light on. "You know what I was thinking about today?" I said. "What?" Page 47. He looked at me, and then he laughed. That real laugh, the one that still surprised me every time, even after months of it, the one that I was increasingly convinced was the best sound in the world. "The misprint," he said. "The misprint," I confirmed. I think about it sometimes. What would have happened if I'd had a different edition? Or if I'd just seen the error myself and you'd had no reason to say anything? You wouldn't have seen it, he said. Not at 8 in the morning on your third day of semester without adequate sleep. You were watching me that closely on day one? I told you, he said. I noticed you on day one. Yeah, I said. You did. He looked at me with that thorough, examining look, the one I learned to recognize as the fullest expression of his attention, the look that meant I was being seen, actually seen, by someone who saw everything. I would have said something eventually, he said, even without the textbook. I was already something about you was already, he paused. I would have found a reason. Is that true? I don't know, he said honestly. I was very defended. I might have let you leave and spent weeks being annoyed at myself. A pause, but I would have found a reason eventually. I think I was looking for one and didn't know it. I squeezed his hand. Good thing I had the wrong edition, I said. Good thing, he agreed. We went back inside. I'm telling you this story the way it happened, which means I'm telling you it isn't finished. Life doesn't finish the way stories are supposed to. Gerald Cobb is still running his campaign and still working through what his son's life looks like against the plans he'd made. Daryl is still in the careful, ongoing process of becoming visible to himself, which takes longer than one honest conversation and requires more courage than any single moment. I'm still a completely average student at Harlow University with a sociology degree in progress and a tendency to watch geese conduct territorial disputes instead of finishing my papers. But I'm also the person Daryl Cobb speaks to every day, the one who knows what he looks like from the outside, the one who gets the late-night texts about whatever he's reading, the one who has a standing seat at a window table in the corner of the library and a coffee waiting on it most mornings, the one who, one Tuesday in September, sat in the wrong chair and started something I couldn't have planned and would never want to undo. And think about what Petra said, back in the beginning, when she first asked if I was falling for him. You do it quietly and completely, she said, and then when it doesn't work out, you act like you're fine when you're not. This worked out. Not neatly, not without cost, not without the months of careful management, and the late nights and the gossip and the 2 in the morning library sessions and the party where I heard the wrong thing and felt the floor tilt under me. Not without his father and the architecture and the years of hiding and the enormous courage it took for him to sit in a driveway and let someone hold his hand in the August light. It worked out because we let it be honest, because we chose honesty over fear, again and again, in the smallest increments and the largest ones. Because 2 people who were both looking for quiet found it in the same place and then found in each other something better than quiet, something real. The campus king who never spoke to anyone spoke to me every single day. And now I know why. Because the quietest person in the room has been waiting their whole life for the one person who truly listens. He just needed to know I was listening. I always was.